Beneath the quiet glow of the Mexican night sky, a legend once moved in silence, his empire soaring high above the ground. His name was Amado Carrillo Fuentes, but to the world he would forever be known as El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. His story is one of contrasts, of unimaginable wealth built on shadows, of power spread across borders, and of a life that ended with a mystery so deep that, decades later, people still whisper whether he truly died. To tell his tale is to step into a world where airplanes carried more than passengers, where the desert winds carried secrets, and where ambition lifted one man higher than most dared to dream. When people think of the great figures of organized crime, names like Pablo Escobar or El Chapo often dominate the conversation. Escobar, with his flamboyance and violence, carved a brutal empire in Colombia, and El Chapo Guzman, with his escapes and ruthlessness, made international headlines. But Amado was different. His name did not always blaze across newspapers in the same sensational way. He avoided unnecessary attention, choosing the shadows rather than the spotlight. And yet, in his time, he controlled more power, more wealth, and more influence than almost anyone in the criminal underworld. His empire stretched beyond Mexico, reaching into Colombia, the United States, and far across oceans. Where Escobar's flamboyance brought him down, Amado's silence carried him farther. But even silence could not protect him forever. Imagine the vast deserts of northern Mexico, quiet under the stars. In that darkness, unseen to most, planes would descend on hidden airstrips, their cargo worth fortunes. It was Amado's innovation, his genius even, that transformed the way drugs moved from one continent to another. While others relied on dangerous convoys, brutal violence, or noisy displays of dominance, Amado took to the skies. He built a fleet of aircraft so large, so sophisticated, that authorities called him, the Lord of the Skies. More than 30 planes, private jets, cargo carriers, and modified airliners, flew under his command, carrying cocaine from Colombia into Mexico, and from there across the border into the United States. To the casual observer, they were just planes moving in the night. But to those in the know, every landing meant millions of dollars, every takeoff another step in building one of the most powerful cartels in history. What made Amado so fascinating, however, was not only his ingenuity but also the mystery surrounding his character. He was not loud or brash. He did not chase the spotlight like John Gotti or throw money into the streets like Escobar. Instead, he preferred calm control. Those who knew him said he could wait patiently, plan carefully, and never let his emotions overtake his decisions. In the violent world of cartels, where one wrong move could mean death, this calmness was his greatest weapon. It earned him loyalty, respect, and fear. His wealth reached into the billions, yet his personality remained measured. For every palace he built, he also built shadows around himself. For every act of violence, there was a strategic calculation behind it. Yet the story of Amado is not just one of power and brilliance. It is also a story of fragility, of the inevitable cracks that appear even in the strongest of empires. His rise was astonishing, his reach almost unmatched, but in the end, it was not a rival's bullet, nor a government's capture, that brought him down. It was a decision born from paranoia, the decision to alter his own body through surgery in an attempt to buy time, to change his appearance, and to escape the tightening grip of the law. On a July night in 1997, inside a private clinic in Mexico City, the Lord of the Skies tried to remake himself. Under the bright lights of the operating room, as surgeons worked, his body gave out. The man who commanded fleets of aircraft could not escape the fragility of the human heart. Even his death, however, is shrouded in doubt. Some say it was real, a sudden end to one of the greatest drug lords in history. Others whisper that it was staged, that Amado used his immense wealth to fake his death, to vanish into another life, perhaps even under another identity. After all, if anyone had the resources to disappear completely, it was him. His funeral, a lavish display of gold and mourning, only deepened the mystery. Was the man in the coffin truly Amado Carrillo Fuentes, or was the Lord of the Skies still out there, watching from the shadows? This is the enigma that draws people to his story even now. Unlike other cartel leaders whose lives burned brightly and ended violently, Amado's tale feels unfinished. His empire collapsed, his successors fought bitterly, and yet his name remains almost mythical. He was not simply another drug lord, he was an architect of the skies, a strategist of shadows, and a figure who mastered both silence and power. His story reminds us that ambition can lift a man higher than anyone expects, but that gravity, in the end, is always waiting. As we begin this journey into the life of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, imagine yourself listening by candlelight, the world outside quiet, your thoughts slowly drifting between reality and legend. You will hear of deserts and airstrips, of alliances and betrayals, of billions earned in silence, and of a single decision on a surgical table that changed everything. It is a story meant not only to inform but to soothe, unfolding like a dream where images drift across the mind, planes gliding silently against a star-filled sky, the hum of engines fading into the night, and a man who seemed untouchable, yet who discovered that even the skies could not carry him forever. This is the beginning of his story, a story of rise and fall, of shadows and silence, of power and fragility. And as the night deepens, we will walk through his world together, step by step, watching the Lord of the Skies build his empire, guard his secrets, and finally, face the fate that even the most powerful cannot escape. In the rolling hills and dusty valleys of Sinaloa, Mexico, where the sun beats down on endless fields and life moves at a slower, quieter rhythm, a boy named Amado Carrillo Fuentes first opened his eyes to the world. Long before he was known as El Señor de los Cielos, he was simply Amado, one of many children in a family that struggled to make ends meet in a land where poverty and opportunity often coexisted in uneasy balance. Sinaloa was no ordinary state. For decades, it had been the cradle of many who would go on to shape Mexico's underworld. Its geography, its poverty, and its traditions created fertile ground for a different kind of ambition, one that would lead Amado toward the shadows of organized crime. The small rural communities of Sinaloa were close-knit, with neighbors who knew each other's stories, with children running barefoot across dirt roads, and with families gathering on porches as the evening cooled. Yet behind that simple beauty lay another story, one of survival. Families needed money, and for many, the land was unforgiving. Agriculture provided some food and trade, but the soil did not always yield enough to escape hardship. For years, men in the region had turned to cultivating opium poppies and marijuana as a way to put food on the table. By the time Amado was born in 1956, the narco culture was already interwoven into the fabric of Sinaloan life. Amado grew up surrounded by these realities. His family was not wealthy, and like many others, he witnessed the daily struggles of providing for a household in a world of scarcity. His father, Walter, worked hard, but hard work alone did not always guarantee stability. The young Amado learned early the meaning of resilience and the weight of responsibility. As he watched older men in the community, some choosing farming, others leaning toward the illegal but lucrative cultivation of narcotics, he understood that choices in Sinaloa were often shaped not by morality but by necessity. But what separated Amado from many others was not simply his exposure to this environment, it was the way he observed it. From an early age, he carried a reputation for being quiet, thoughtful, and watchful. He was not the loudest child, nor the most reckless. Instead, he had a patience that gave him an edge, even as a boy. In places where opportunity was scarce, patience and observation were skills as valuable as strength. These qualities would later define the man he became, a man who calculated moves with precision, who preferred silence to noise, and who outlived many louder, more reckless figures. As Amado grew into adolescence, the influence of his extended family became more significant. In particular, his uncle, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, better known as Don Neto, was already rising within the Guadalajara cartel. To young Amado, Don Neto represented a glimpse into a world beyond poverty, a world where influence stretched far, and where wealth seemed boundless. For a boy from rural Sinaloa, watching his uncle's ascent must have left a lasting impression. The seeds of ambition were planted not through glamorous tales of wealth, but through the realization that family ties could open doors that otherwise remained shut. Still, Amado's early years were not marked by immediate entry into the drug trade. Like many young men, he received his education and lived a life that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. He studied in local schools, walked the same paths as his neighbors, and carried the same expectations of contributing to the family. Yet deep within, he began to dream of something larger. For Amado, staying in Sinaloa to live the same hard life as generations before him was not enough. He was determined to rise above the limitations of his birthplace. The environment around him constantly reinforced this dream. Sinaloa was already gaining a reputation as the land that birthed capos. The stories of men who had gone from simple fields to immense power were whispered across kitchens and bars. Amado listened, and though he did not speak of it openly, he absorbed the lesson. In a land of scarcity, the bold carved their own path. And perhaps more importantly, the smart survived longer than the bold. He was also shaped by something else, by the rhythm of the land itself. Nights in Sinaloa carried a certain quietness, the air filled with the sounds of crickets and distant dogs barking, the skies wide and endless. It was a silence that could make a young mind wander, imagining what lay beyond the horizon. Those endless skies would one day become his domain, but as a boy, they were simply a canvas of possibility. The contrast between the smallness of his village life and the vastness of the world around him became a kind of silent challenge. By the time he reached his late teens, Amado began gravitating toward opportunities that brought him closer to his uncle's world. He was ambitious but careful. Unlike other young men who rushed into reckless acts of violence or petty crimes, he preferred to move quietly, to learn before acting. Don Nito's shadow loomed large, offering both temptation and mentorship. Family was the bridge, and through it, Amado found his way into the first circles of the underworld. The transition from a boy in Sinaloa to a young man stepping into crime was subtle, not explosive. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic scenes. Instead, there was patience, listening, and learning. He observed the way older men managed operations, how loyalty was bought, how silence was rewarded, and how fear was instilled. He learned that in this world, those who shouted the loudest often fell the fastest. It was those who remained calm, who watched, who planned, that truly endured. Amado's childhood and youth in Sinaloa were, in many ways, the foundation of everything he would later build. The struggles of poverty taught him resilience. The whispers of opportunity taught him ambition. The example of his uncle taught him direction. And the silence of the Sinaloan nights taught him patience. These elements fused to create a young man who would one day revolutionize the drug trade, not through chaos and noise, but through strategy and silence. Looking back, it is striking to think of the boy who once played in dusty fields, watching planes streak across the sky, imagining perhaps what it would feel like to command such power. In time, those daydreams would transform into reality, and the skies themselves would become his empire. But in those early days, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was just another boy from Sinaloa, carrying within him the seeds of a destiny that no one, perhaps not even he, could fully imagine. The transition from the innocence of childhood into the uncertain steps of adulthood is never simple, and for Amado Carrillo Fuentes, those steps led him gradually into the hidden corridors of Mexico's criminal underworld. The world he entered was not glamorous, not gilded with luxury or spectacle. It was a world of whispers, late-night meetings, and careful observation, a world where the quietest voice often carried the greatest weight. Amado's journey into this life began slowly, like the first shadows creeping across the desert as the sun sets, almost unnoticeable at first, until darkness has quietly taken hold. His earliest forays into crime came through the influence of his uncle, Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo, one of the founding pillars of the Guadalajara cartel. Don Neto, by the early 1980s, was already an established figure, a man with authority and respect who had carved out a significant role in the drug trade alongside Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo and Rafael Caro Quintero. For a young man like Amado, still in his 20s, being near such figures was both a privilege and a responsibility. He was introduced not with fanfare, but with quiet trust. His family ties gave him an entry, but it was his demeanor, calm, steady, attentive, that earned him a place worth keeping. Amado began as many protégés did, learning the logistics that kept the trade alive. In those days, the drug trade in Mexico was still shifting. Marijuana and heroin had long been staples, but cocaine was becoming the true currency of power, flowing in from Colombia and destined for the United States. Moving such cargo was not simple, it required safe routes, reliable men, and constant vigilance against both rivals and authorities. Amado's first jobs were likely modest in appearance, supervising shipments, keeping records, managing people who moved packages across dusty roads or hidden mountain paths. But in reality, these roles were the foundation of an empire. Every detail mattered. Every error could bring disaster. He did not rise quickly by being reckless, instead, he rose by being precise. Those around him noticed that he did not boast about his tasks, nor did he flaunt small successes. He absorbed knowledge like a sponge, understanding the delicate balance between ambition and discretion. Many young men in his position might have tried to prove themselves with bold, violent acts. Amado did the opposite. He earned trust by avoiding unnecessary risks, showing that he was reliable, level-headed, and always thinking ahead. His charisma, too, began to show, not the loud, magnetic charisma of a flamboyant leader, but the subtler kind that put men at ease. He spoke with calm confidence, never rushing his words, never letting emotion overtake his tone. In a business where hot tempers often led to bloody mistakes, Amado's restraint was refreshing. He gave the impression of someone who could be trusted with secrets, with responsibilities, and eventually, with lives. The Guadalajara cartel itself was like a school for him, a place where he could study both brilliance and folly. He saw how Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the Godfather, orchestrated alliances with Colombian cartels, ensuring a steady supply of cocaine that would flood into the United States. He watched how Don Neto managed relationships with politicians and law enforcement, understanding that power did not rest solely in weapons but in the ability to buy silence. And he observed the recklessness of Rafael Caro Quintero, whose impulsive actions would bring devastating consequences. Each lesson shaped Amado's philosophy. Patience and calculation would carry him further than bravado ever could. In these early years, Amado also learned the importance of loyalty, but loyalty in this world was never simple. It was built not only on family ties or friendship but on money, trust, and fear. He began to cultivate his own network of men who depended on him, who trusted his leadership. Slowly, he was no longer just a young man learning the trade, he was becoming a figure others looked to for direction. His influence grew not through violence but through reliability. In a dangerous business, reliability was a treasure. Yet danger was never far away. The Guadalajara cartel operated under constant risk. American agencies, particularly the DEA, were beginning to take greater notice of the flows of cocaine entering their borders. Corruption shielded much of the cartel's activity, but no shield was perfect. Raids, arrests, and betrayals were part of daily life. For Amado, every brush with risk was another reminder that survival required more than courage, it required vision. One of the pivotal moments in Amado's early career came with his deeper involvement in aviation. While at first he may have been merely managing ground-level logistics, he began to recognize the enormous potential of controlling the skies. Airplanes could move cargo faster, safer, and in greater quantities than any convoy on the ground. While others thought only of trucks, hidden compartments, and border tunnels, Amado was already imagining fleets of aircraft cutting silently across night skies. These were not yet his planes, not yet his empire, but the idea took root in his mind during these formative years. It would later become his greatest innovation, the very thing that gave him his immortal nickname. At the same time, his personal life remained disciplined. Unlike some who indulged in drugs, alcohol, or reckless pleasures, Amado maintained a careful distance. This too set him apart. He wanted control, not indulgence. He understood that those who lost themselves in excess often lost their grip on power. His restraint, though quiet, made him stronger. It allowed him to focus entirely on building a future. Foreshadowing his later career, there was also a darkness to his calm. Though he avoided unnecessary violence, he was not above using it when required. Stories suggest that even in his early days, he made examples of those who betrayed trust or jeopardized operations. The difference was that his violence was always calculated, never wasted. It was not about sending a message to the world, it was about quietly ensuring that betrayal would not be repeated. By the mid-1980s, Amado had moved from being an apprentice under Don Neto to becoming a trusted lieutenant with ambitions of his own. He was no longer simply watching others play the game, he was beginning to play it himself, carefully moving his pieces across the board. His influence within the Guadalajara cartel grew steadily, and with it, his vision for something larger began to take shape. Looking back, these first steps into the narco world were crucial. They were the foundation on which the Lord of the Skies would later build his empire. They taught him the importance of silence, the value of patience, and the power of innovation. They showed him the fragility of life in this world, where recklessness could end everything overnight. And perhaps most importantly, they gave him a taste of the skies, the realization that whoever controlled the air would one day control the trade. As the shadows of the Guadalajara cartel stretched across Mexico, Amado stood within them, learning, planning, preparing. He was not yet the Lord of the Skies, not yet the billionaire capo with a fleet of aircraft. But the journey had begun, and with each step, he moved closer to becoming a figure whose name would echo far beyond the deserts of Sinaloa. The Guadalajara cartel in the 1980s was more than just a criminal organization, it was a kingdom hidden in plain sight, a carefully constructed empire that linked the mountains of Mexico with the jungles of Colombia and the bustling cities of the United States. For a young and observant Amado Carrillo Fuentes, stepping into this world was like entering a vast classroom where every decision was a lesson, every mistake a warning, and every success a glimpse of what might one day be his. The cartel was ruthless, powerful, and constantly evolving, and it became the crucible in which Amado's instincts were sharpened. At its peak, the Guadalajara cartel was led by three giants, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known as El Padrino or the Godfather, who served as the mastermind and organizer, Rafael Caro Quintero, whose brashness and ambition made him feared and admired in equal measure, and Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo, Amado's uncle, who was both a mentor and protector to him. Together, these men had transformed drug trafficking in Mexico from scattered operations into a highly centralized system. They brokered deals directly with Colombia's Medellin cartel, ensuring that cocaine shipments arrived in bulk to Mexico before being smuggled across the U.S. border. For Amado, being in proximity to these figures was both an opportunity and a test. He was no longer a boy observing from the sidelines in Sinaloa, he was now immersed in an environment where billions of dollars flowed like hidden rivers, where bribes bought silence from authorities, and where one wrong move could cost lives. The Guadalajara cartel was not simply an organization, it was a machine. Every gear, every wheel, every connection mattered, and Amado was studying how it all worked. The cartel's operations were sprawling. Marijuana fields stretched across Sinaloa and Durango, hidden beneath the sun, while heroin and cocaine flowed through airstrips and secret corridors toward the United States. Politicians, police officers, and military officials were on the payroll, creating a web of protection that allowed the cartel to operate with near impunity. Entire towns depended on the illicit economy, with farmers cultivating illegal crops alongside corn and beans, and small businesses thriving on the money that trickled down. In many ways, the cartel was both a criminal enterprise and a shadow government, dictating life in regions where the state's presence was weak. Amado learned here the importance of relationships. Félix Gallardo taught the art of diplomacy, of treating cocaine shipments like international contracts, requiring negotiation, patience, and foresight. Don Neto revealed the value of alliances with political figures, showing Amado that power was not just about guns and money but also about influence, favors, and silence bought at the right price. Caro Quintero, though brash, offered another lesson, that recklessness could bring down even the strongest. Each of these mentors revealed a different facet of power, and Amado, patient as always, absorbed it all. The cartel's golden era, however, was built on fragile ground. In 1985, everything changed with the abduction and murder of DEA agent Enrique "Kiki" Camarena. Caro Quintero, impulsive and driven by paranoia, ordered the kidnapping of Camarena, believing the agent had infiltrated too deeply into their operations. What followed was an act of violence that shook not only Mexico but the entire international community. Camarena was tortured and killed, his body buried in a shallow grave. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The U.S. government responded with Operation Leyenda, one of the most intense DEA investigations in history. Suddenly, the protection that had shielded the cartel began to crack under pressure. The Mexican government, under international scrutiny, could no longer ignore the cartel's impunity. Caro Quintero was arrested in Costa Rica. Don Neto was captured soon after. And though Felix Gallardo initially managed to evade capture, the unity of the Guadalajara cartel was shattered. For Amado, this was both a moment of danger and of opportunity. He had seen firsthand how the recklessness of one man could dismantle an empire that seemed invincible. The lesson was clear: discretion was survival. Unlike Caro Quintero, Amado would never allow personal emotion to dictate his moves. Unlike Gallardo, he would not build an empire so centralized that its fall would bring everything crashing down. Amado began to understand that the future of organized crime in Mexico lay in diversification, in the decentralization of power, and in innovation. In the chaotic years following the collapse of the Guadalajara cartel, Amado positioned himself carefully. While many others scrambled, forming new alliances or waging bloody wars over territory, he chose patience. He knew that survival was not about making the loudest move but the smartest one. He built trust with Colombian suppliers, presenting himself as a reliable partner even as others fell. He quietly cultivated relationships with officials who could shield him from scrutiny. And most importantly, he began envisioning a new model for trafficking, one that would depend not on fields and convoys alone, but on fleets of airplanes soaring silently through the skies. The fall of the Guadalajara cartel was, in many ways, the birth of Mexico's modern cartel system. Out of its ashes, new organizations would rise: the Tijuana cartel, the Gulf cartel, and eventually the Sinaloa cartel. But among all these emerging powers, Amado stood apart. He was not rushing to fill the void with flashy violence. He was quietly observing, positioning himself for a move that would not just give him territory but would reshape the very logistics of the trade. It is easy to imagine him during these years, sitting in quiet meetings, listening more than speaking, letting others argue or boast while he calculated the long game. He had seen how the mighty could fall, how a single reckless decision could unravel years of power. And so he sharpened his philosophy: power must be silent, influence must be subtle, and wealth must be built like an invisible empire, carried not by noise but by shadows. The Guadalajara cartel was both a stage and a warning. It gave Amado his training, his network, and his first taste of serious power. But it also showed him the dangers of arrogance and exposure. The collapse of this once mighty organization did not discourage him, it inspired him. For in the ruins of Guadalajara, Amado saw the outline of the future, a future where he would not simply inherit a cartel, but design one of his own, one that would take to the skies and make him a legend. The mid to late 1980s were a time of chaos in Mexico's underworld. The mighty Guadalajara cartel had collapsed under the weight of international outrage and government crackdowns after the murder of DEA agent Enrique "Kiki" Camarena. Leaders were imprisoned, alliances fractured, and the once centralized structure of Mexican drug trafficking splintered into smaller, competing organizations. For many, this period was defined by panic and desperation. Yet for Amado Carrillo Fuentes, it was a moment to study the shifting landscape, to move carefully through the cracks of a crumbling empire, and to begin building something entirely new. Amado had been trained in the shadows of great men, Felix Gallardo, Caro Quintero, and his uncle, Don Neto, but he had also learned the dangers of arrogance, centralization, and reckless violence. When the cartel's empire disintegrated, Amado did not try to seize the spotlight. He understood that being too visible was fatal. Instead, he quietly maneuvered himself into positions of influence, leveraging relationships with Colombians and Mexican operators who were desperate for stability in a time of uncertainty. One of his first key moves was aligning himself with Pablo Escobar's Medellín cartel. Unlike others in Mexico who were scrambling to secure supply lines, Amado presented himself as reliable, disciplined, and discreet. The Colombians valued consistency above all else, and Amado knew how to deliver. While others boasted of their muscle or wealth, Amado promised efficiency and silence. Slowly, he became one of Escobar's trusted Mexican partners, ensuring the safe transport of cocaine shipments through Mexico and into the United States. But Amado's genius lay not only in securing Colombian trust, it was in reimagining logistics. The old system relied heavily on land convoys, hidden trucks, and border tunnels. These methods were effective but slow and vulnerable to raids. Amado envisioned something far more ambitious. Airplanes. Large fleets of them, crisscrossing the skies, carrying tons of cocaine directly from Colombia to Mexico, bypassing much of the risk. This idea would earn him his legendary nickname, El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. In these early years, Amado was not yet commanding fleets of jets. But he was laying the groundwork. He invested profits into aircraft, bribed airport officials, and built relationships with pilots willing to risk everything for a share of the fortune. Small airstrips across northern Mexico became vital arteries in his developing system. To many, these looked like modest operations. To Amado, they were the skeleton of an empire in the making. At the same time, Amado proved himself skilled at navigating politics and corruption. He understood that the collapse of the Guadalajara cartel had shaken Mexican authorities, who were now under international scrutiny. But he also recognized that officials, police commanders, military officers, even politicians, still wanted their share of the profits. Amado became a master at balancing this delicate relationship. He paid generously, but he demanded silence and loyalty in return. Unlike the flamboyant bribes of others, his approach was methodical, almost bureaucratic. To him, corruption was not about buying favors once, it was about creating a dependable system of protection that would endure. As the old guard was dismantled, new cartels began to emerge. The Arellano Felix brothers established the Tijuana cartel. Juan Garcia Abrego solidified the Gulf cartel. Joaquin, El Chapo, Guzman, Hector, El Güero, Palma, and others began carving out what would eventually become the Sinaloa cartel. Mexico's underworld was fragmenting into rival kingdoms, each fighting for dominance. Amid this turbulence, Amado avoided reckless wars. He chose patience over bloodshed. While rivals fought over plazas, Amado focused on infrastructure, routes, and planes. He did not need headlines, he needed efficiency. There was something almost invisible about his rise. Unlike the flamboyant Arellano Felix brothers, who flaunted their power with extravagance, or Escobar, who turned himself into a celebrity outlaw, Amado cultivated an aura of discretion. He blended into the background, wearing plain clothes, speaking in measured tones, rarely showing anger. Associates described him as calm, calculating, and unerringly patient. This was no accident. Amado was crafting an image of quiet control, knowing that the loudest man in the room was often the first to fall. Family also played a role in these years. Amado began to bring his brothers into the business, most notably Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, who would later inherit the Juárez Cartel. This was a careful move. Amado trusted few outside blood, and by elevating his relatives, he ensured loyalty within his growing circle. Still, he kept ultimate control in his own hands. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a period of transition not just for Amado but for Mexico itself. Political changes, economic crises, and rising U.S. pressure created both obstacles and opportunities. The Mexican government, while publicly vowing to fight drug trafficking, was riddled with corruption. Officials at every level were willing to turn a blind eye in exchange for bribes, and Amado was quick to exploit this weakness. He cultivated contacts that shielded him from law enforcement, allowing his operations to expand while rivals drew unwanted attention. Step by step, Amado's power grew. By the early 1990s, he had control over critical routes through northern Mexico, particularly in Chihuahua. From there, drugs could move efficiently into Texas, New Mexico, and beyond. Juárez, a city that sat at the edge of two worlds, became his stronghold. The Juárez corridor was a goldmine, and Amado secured it with precision. In time, it would become the centerpiece of his empire, the foundation of the Juárez Cartel. What made this transition so fascinating was how quietly it happened. One could almost imagine Amado during these years, sitting in a modest office, maps spread before him, marking air routes and supply lines while rivals sprayed bullets in the streets. He did not need to prove his strength with violence. His strength was in the skies, in the silent flight of planes carrying fortunes above the clouds, unseen by the battles raging below. It was in this period, after the fall of Guadalajara and before his full rise, that Amado forged his identity. He was not merely a survivor of the cartel wars, he was an architect of a new model. While others chased power through blood and spectacle, Amado pursued it through strategy, logistics, and patience. These were the years that transformed him from a background figure into a rising force, a man destined to reshape the drug trade in Mexico forever. And yet, this was only the beginning. What lay ahead was not just expansion but dominance. As the 1990s unfolded, Amado would no longer be content with building in the shadows. He would emerge as El Señor de los Cielos, commanding fleets of aircraft, billions of dollars, and the fear of governments on both sides of the border. But for now, he remained calm, methodical, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By the early 1990s, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was no longer just a quiet operator learning the craft of trafficking. He had survived the collapse of the Guadalajara cartel, navigated the violent reshuffling of Mexico's underworld, and positioned himself in a unique place of advantage. It was during this period that he fully embraced the identity that would define his legend, El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. His empire would not be built on flamboyant violence or reckless bravado but on the silent wings of aircraft flying above borders, carrying fortunes in their cargo holds, unseen by most of the world below. To understand the brilliance of Amado's vision, one must picture the drug trade of the time. Land routes were saturated, often guarded by heavily armed traffickers and constantly threatened by border patrols and rival gangs. The U.S.-Mexico border was becoming more militarized, with checkpoints, dogs, and surveillance increasing every year. Smugglers had to take greater risks for smaller profits. But the sky, expansive, silent, and underutilized, was an opportunity waiting for someone bold enough to seize it. Amado was that man. He began assembling fleets of aircraft, ranging from small private planes to large Boeing 727s capable of carrying tons of cocaine in a single journey. His operations relied on secret landing strips carved out of desert landscapes, on pilots trained to fly low to avoid radar detection, and on a network of corrupt officials who ensured safe passage. What made his model extraordinary was its scale. Others had used planes before, but Amado turned it into an industrial system. Dozens of flights could be moving at once, each carrying millions in value. To fund this operation, Amado reinvested his profits strategically. While rivals spent their money on flashy mansions, luxury cars, and public displays of wealth, Amado poured resources into logistics. He bought planes outright, bribed customs officers at airports, and recruited a dedicated cadre of mechanics, pilots, and engineers to maintain his airborne fleet. His empire became as much a transportation company as a criminal cartel, with efficiency, coordination, and reliability at its core. The Colombians adored him for this. For Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, reliability was worth more than loyalty. They needed someone who could move product safely, consistently, and in large volumes. Amado delivered. His fleet could transport far more than land convoys or maritime routes, making him one of the most valuable partners to Colombian suppliers. This relationship, built on trust and logistics, gave him access to enormous quantities of cocaine, an asset that positioned him above most of his Mexican rivals. Juárez became the beating heart of this empire. The city, sitting directly across from El Paso, Texas, was an ideal gateway into the United States. From Juárez, cocaine could flow seamlessly into distribution networks reaching Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and beyond. Amado turned Juárez into his fortress. He cultivated relationships with local politicians, law enforcement, and businessmen, ensuring the city became a hub that functioned both as a safe haven and a launch pad for international shipments. By controlling Juárez, Amado didn't just control a city, he controlled one of the most profitable corridors in the world. What set Amado apart was not only his innovation but his discretion. While his empire expanded at an astonishing rate, he avoided the flamboyance of figures like the Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel, who flaunted their wealth in nightclubs, or Escobar, who waged open war against governments. Amado preferred silence. He dressed plainly, traveled carefully, and rarely drew attention to himself in public. His fortune grew into the billions, but unlike others, he did not crave the spotlight. Instead, he cultivated the image of a man blending into the background, a figure you might overlook in a crowded room even as he controlled one of the largest trafficking empires in history. Still, whispers of his power began to spread. Associates spoke of his calm demeanor, of how he rarely raised his voice but always got his way. To those within his circle, his word was law. To rivals, his reputation was intimidating, for he was known not only for his business acumen but also for his ability to quietly remove threats. Violence was not his trademark, but when necessary, it was swift and decisive, carried out in silence, leaving no room for misinterpretation. By this stage, Amado was making an estimated $25 billion annually, an astronomical sum that rivaled the wealth of Escobar himself. His aircraft were carrying hundreds of tons of cocaine each year, feeding the insatiable demand of the American market. For many, it seemed as if Amado had discovered the perfect formula: wealth, power, and influence built not through chaos but through discipline and logistics. Yet with great power came new challenges. The Mexican government, pressured by the United States, could no longer ignore the rise of cartels. Though corruption remained rampant, the scale of Amado's operations made him impossible to overlook forever. Surveillance tightened. Rumors spread. Rival cartels, particularly the Tijuana cartel and the Gulf cartel, began to view him as a direct competitor. For Amado, maintaining his empire required not only innovation but also constant vigilance. He had to keep ahead of both enemies and authorities, ensuring that his system remained invisible even as it grew. Still, during these years, Amado seemed untouchable. The Lord of the Skies had elevated trafficking to an art form, turning aircraft into the veins of an empire that stretched across continents. To picture his operations is to imagine the night sky above northern Mexico, a fleet of planes flying low and silent, their engines humming softly against the darkness, carrying fortunes through the clouds. Below, towns slept unaware, while above, billions moved invisibly, orchestrated by a man who rarely appeared but whose influence was everywhere. This was Amado at his peak of innovation, a figure who had taken lessons from the past and transformed them into a vision of the future. Where others had fallen, he soared, literally and figuratively. But in the world of cartels, no empire can remain invisible forever. The higher one flies, the greater the risk of being brought down. 4. Now, however, Amado was untouchable, the master of the skies, the architect of an empire unlike anything Mexico had seen before. The early 1990s marked the true consolidation of Amado Carrillo Fuentes' empire. By now, he had fully embraced his identity as El Señor de los Cielos, commanding fleets of aircraft that carried unimaginable quantities of cocaine from Colombia into Mexico. But logistics alone did not make an empire. To transform wealth into lasting power, Amado needed to secure territory, build loyalty, and establish Juárez as the unshakable heart of his operations. It was here, in the dust and neon of this border city, that he built the foundation of what would become known as the Juárez Cartel. Juárez was unlike any other city in Mexico. Sitting directly across from El Paso, Texas, it was a borderland where cultures merged, economies intertwined, and opportunities flowed in both directions. Its location made it invaluable, a direct gateway to one of the busiest commercial crossings into the United States. Whoever controlled Juárez controlled a floodgate through which billions of dollars in narcotics could move. Amado understood this better than anyone, and he invested himself fully in turning Juárez into his stronghold. One of his first steps was embedding himself into the fabric of the city. He built alliances with local politicians, offering financial backing in exchange for protection and silence. Police forces, already underpaid and often corrupt, were brought under his payroll, ensuring that raids and arrests rarely threatened his operations. Even sectors of the military, stationed to guard the border, found themselves accepting bribes to look the other way as shipments passed. Amado's genius lay not only in paying people off but in structuring these bribes as a reliable system. Everyone knew their place, everyone received their cut, and in return, his operations flowed without interruption. But corruption alone could not secure Juárez. The 1990s were a violent era in Mexico's underworld, with rival cartels fighting tooth and nail for control of lucrative smuggling routes. The Arellano Felix brothers had carved out the Tijuana corridor, Juan Garcia Abrego controlled the Gulf routes, and rising figures like Joaquin, El Chapo, Guzman were pushing aggressively into Sinaloa and beyond. Inevitably, competition arose. Amado's growing dominance in Juárez made him a target. Here, his approach to violence stood out. Unlike the Arellano Felix clan, who ruled through open brutality, or Escobar, who unleashed terror campaigns, Amado preferred precision. Violence was not his language of choice, it was his last resort. But when it came, it was swift, targeted, and devastating. Those who opposed him in Juárez often disappeared quietly, their absence a warning more chilling than public displays of bloodshed. This calculated use of force allowed Amado to maintain order without drawing unnecessary attention. At the same time, Amado understood the importance of loyalty. He began weaving his family deeper into the fabric of the cartel. His brother Vicente Carrillo Fuentes became one of his closest lieutenants, handling operations and enforcing discipline within the ranks. Other relatives and trusted allies were placed in key positions, ensuring that betrayal from within was minimized. This reliance on family created a core of stability that many other cartels lacked. While rivals fell to internal disputes and power struggles, Amado's circle remained tightly bound. The wealth pouring into Juárez was staggering. Amado's aircraft could move multiple tons of cocaine in a single trip, each shipment worth hundreds of millions once it crossed into the United States. To launder this fortune, Amado invested heavily in legitimate businesses. Construction companies, hotels, and financial institutions in Juárez and elsewhere became vehicles through which illicit profits were cleaned and reinvested. Skyscrapers rose, casinos flourished, and for many in Juárez, the economic boom was undeniable. Entire neighborhoods benefited indirectly from the money circulating through the city, creating a strange duality. While fear of the cartel was ever present, so too was a sense of prosperity tied to its shadow economy. Still, beneath this surface of wealth and order, paranoia simmered. The more powerful Amado became, the more dangerous his position grew. He was not a man given to reckless displays, but he was acutely aware that rivals, authorities, and even international agencies had begun to fix their gaze on him. The United States, having declared war on drugs after Escobar's death, now saw Amado as one of the primary figures to watch. Mexican authorities, pressured by Washington, were forced to at least appear to investigate. For Amado, this meant constant vigilance. He lived with a quiet paranoia, moving carefully, rarely sleeping in the same place twice, ensuring that layers of protection surrounded him at all times. Yet his public image remained curiously subdued. Unlike Escobar, whose face was plastered across magazines and TV screens, Amado managed to maintain a veil of anonymity. To the average person in Mexico, his name carried whispers but not headlines. He cultivated this invisibility carefully, blending wealth and power into the everyday structures of Juárez rather than flaunting it. In this, he was a paradox, one of the richest men in the world, commanding billions, yet largely unknown outside circles of crime and law enforcement. The consolidation of Juárez marked a turning point. No longer was Amado merely an operator within a larger system, he had become the system. His cartel rivaled, and in some ways surpassed, the power of Escobar's Medellín and Cali connections. He controlled not only cocaine routes but also marijuana and heroin flows, diversifying his empire to ensure resilience. His influence stretched from Colombia to the United States, and every deal, every shipment, and every dollar passed through the structures he had built. But what made his reign particularly striking was the calmness with which he conducted it. In a world where violence often screamed the loudest, Amado's silence was more terrifying. He embodied patience, discretion, and a mastery of logistics that set him apart from his peers. In Juárez, he was not just feared, he was respected, even admired, by those who saw in him a figure who controlled chaos without succumbing to it. The early 1990s thus became the years of consolidation, of empire building, of laying down roots so deep that even the fiercest storms could not easily uproot them. Amado had transformed Juárez into his kingdom, his plains into wings of fortune, and his family into the backbone of a cartel destined to dominate. Yet, as with all great empires, shadows loomed on the horizon. For in the world of power, no consolidation is ever permanent, and no empire remains unchallenged forever. By the mid-1990s, Amado Carrillo Fuentes had risen to a level of wealth and influence so immense that whispers spread he was the single most powerful drug trafficker in the world. Some even claimed that after the fall of Pablo Escobar in 1993, Amado had quietly taken the Colombian's crown as the king of global narcotics. Whether or not those claims were entirely true, there was no denying that his empire had grown to a scale unmatched in Mexico, and perhaps beyond. This was the zenith of his reign, the years when El Señor de los Cielos stood at the very peak of the underworld, his fleets of aircraft cutting through the skies like invisible arteries of an empire. The numbers themselves tell the story of his power. It is estimated that Amado's operations were generating revenues exceeding $25 billion annually. This staggering fortune flowed from his mastery of logistics. Each one of his Boeing 727s or smaller jets could carry multiple tons of cocaine in a single journey. Entire shipments worth hundreds of millions would land on secret airstrips in northern Mexico, before being broken down and funneled into the United States through Juárez, El Paso, and other corridors. At his peak, Amado's fleet was said to include more than 30 aircraft, many of them modified to avoid detection. Pilots flew low, often under radar, and when a plane became too risky to use, Amado ordered it dismantled or abandoned in the desert, better to lose hardware than risk exposure. It was this reliance on the skies that not only earned him his legendary nickname but also set him apart from his rivals. While the Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel were bogged down in bloody wars for territory, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was still consolidating power in Sinaloa, Amado seemed untouchable, his empire operating with the smooth precision of a multinational corporation. Where others flaunted their dominance with violence or spectacle, Amado relied on silence and efficiency. His genius lay in turning drug trafficking into something resembling an industrial supply chain, with fleets, routes, and personnel organized as if they were part of a legitimate airline company. His influence extended beyond logistics. Politicians, police commanders, generals, and bankers were all within his grasp. Corruption was the lifeblood of cartels, but Amado managed it with extraordinary discipline. He did not merely bribe to escape raids, he built long-term relationships, ensuring loyalty through consistent payments and favors. Mexican officials often looked the other way as his shipments crossed borders, and U.S. agencies struggled to pin him down because his operations left so few traces. His ability to maintain this invisibility while amassing a fortune rivaling that of Fortune 500 companies only deepened his legend. Juárez, by now, had transformed under his control. The city had become a bustling hub not just of commerce but of cartel-driven prosperity. Money poured into construction, casinos, and hotels. Families connected to the cartel enjoyed lives of luxury, while ordinary residents found their local economy buoyed by the influx of drug money. Of course, fear still lingered in every shadow. Everyone in Juárez knew who truly controlled the city. It was Amado's men who decided what shipments moved, who lived, and who disappeared. Yet unlike cartels that ruled through spectacle and chaos, Amado's grip on Juárez was quiet but absolute, a kind of order that kept rival gangs and reckless violence at bay. Internationally, Amado became the indispensable link between Colombian suppliers and the American market. The Cali cartel, which rose after Escobar's fall, relied heavily on Amado's infrastructure to move its product north. His reliability earned him a reputation as one of the few figures who could replace Escobar in terms of global reach. But unlike Escobar, Amado never declared war on governments or courted celebrity. He remained in the shadows, his power whispered about but rarely displayed. This was perhaps his greatest advantage. While Escobar's name became synonymous with violence and spectacle, Amado remained elusive, a figure who many ordinary people could not even picture. His wealth allowed him to live in extraordinary comfort, though he rarely flaunted it. Reports describe mansions across Mexico and safe houses stocked with luxury goods. Private jets, lavish estates, and fleets of expensive cars were within his reach, but Amado preferred a more discreet lifestyle. Associates often remarked on his calm demeanor, his plain clothing, his ability to blend in even when surrounded by wealth. This restraint made him even more mysterious. He was a billionaire trafficker who avoided the spotlight, an invisible king ruling from behind drawn curtains. Still, even as he consolidated power, the risks mounted. Rival cartels viewed him with envy and suspicion. The Tijuana cartel resented his dominance, and tensions with the Gulf cartel simmered beneath the surface. Meanwhile, U.S. authorities grew increasingly concerned about his scale of operations. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, began to refer to him as the most powerful trafficker in the world, putting him firmly on Washington's radar. Mexican authorities, under pressure from the United States, could no longer ignore his empire entirely. Surveillance tightened, investigations mounted, and whispers of betrayal from within always lurked. Despite these threats, Amado projected calm. He carried himself like a man who believed his system was too advanced, too invisible to be dismantled. In many ways, he was correct. His empire had become so deeply rooted in corruption, infrastructure, and global supply chains that removing him would require extraordinary force. The DEA knew this. Mexican officials knew this. And Amado himself knew it most of all. Yet with great power comes great paranoia. Though he lived discreetly, Amado was acutely aware of the enemies circling him. He rotated safe houses constantly, surrounded himself with trusted guards, and relied on his family to run much of his business. He trusted few, but even trust was never absolute. The higher he climbed, the lonelier and more dangerous the air became. At this peak, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was no longer simply a drug lord. He was a myth in motion, a man who commanded the skies, who moved billions with silence, who stood in the shadows while governments searched for him in vain. His empire dwarfed those of his rivals, and his reputation spread beyond Mexico's borders into whispers in Washington, Bogota, and Madrid. Some said he was untouchable. Others believed he was doomed, for in the world of cartels, no one flies forever. For now, however, he stood at the summit of power, wealth, and influence. He was El Señor de los Cielos, the man who ruled not from the streets or the jungles, but from the skies themselves. And as he soared higher, the world below could only watch in awe and unease, waiting for the moment when the weight of his empire might finally begin to drag him back down to earth. The 1990s marked both the zenith of Amado Carrillo Fuentes' empire and the gradual unraveling of the very foundations that had carried him to power. For years, Amado had lived by a simple philosophy: keep operations efficient, corruption steady, and his personal image low. This approach had shielded him from the chaos that engulfed other cartels. Unlike Pablo Escobar, who openly waged war against the Colombian government, or the Arellano Felix brothers, who invited attention through violent spectacle, Amado preferred shadows and silence. But shadows are not eternal, and by the mid to late 1990s, the empire of El Señor de los Cielos was beginning to show cracks. The first major source of pressure came from within Mexico itself. Rival cartels grew increasingly hostile to Amado's dominance. The Tijuana cartel, led by the Arellano Felix brothers, resented his control of the Juárez corridor, which was by far the most profitable drug trafficking route into the United States. Their operations relied heavily on smuggling through Baja California, but Amado's logistical superiority, his fleet of aircraft, his well-oiled supply chains, and his control of Juárez, threatened to eclipse their profits. Tensions simmered, and though outright war was avoided, assassinations, ambushes, and betrayals were constant risks. At the same time, the Gulf Cartel under Juan Garcia Abrego posed another challenge. While Amado's strength lay in cocaine shipments from Colombia to Mexico, Garcia Abrego was deeply entrenched in smuggling corridors across Texas. The Gulf Cartel's violent reputation and close ties with corrupt officials in northeastern Mexico made them a dangerous competitor. In a world where alliances shifted constantly, Amado had to navigate these rivalries carefully, often striking temporary deals while remaining wary of betrayal. The greatest external threat, however, came not from rivals but from governments. By the mid-1990s, the DEA and U.S. intelligence agencies had begun to identify Amado as the most powerful trafficker in the world. Unlike Escobar, he had not declared war against the state, which made him harder to track, but also more infuriating to agencies who struggled to pin him down. His quiet empire, built on efficiency rather than chaos, was almost invisible to outsiders. But invisibility has its limits. Each billion-dollar shipment attracted scrutiny. Each abandoned plane left in the desert whispered a trace of his vast operations. Pressure mounted on the Mexican government as well. The United States demanded action, especially after Escobar's death in 1993 left Amado as the clear inheritor of Colombian trafficking routes. Washington wanted results, and Mexican authorities, long accused of corruption and complicity, were forced to at least appear committed to dismantling his empire. Rumors began to swirl that even within the Mexican government, powerful factions were reconsidering their alliances with El Señor de los Cielos. Some saw him as too powerful, too wealthy, and too much of a liability as U.S. attention intensified. This growing paranoia seeped into Amado's daily life. Once known for his calm demeanor and ability to blend in, he now became increasingly cautious, rotating safe houses, surrounding himself with layers of security, and trusting fewer and fewer people. Yet even within his circle, betrayal lurked. Associates who had once been loyal could now be tempted by rival offers or pressured by law enforcement. Family ties remained strong, but even bloodlines were not always a guarantee in the ruthless world of narco politics. Meanwhile, his immense wealth began to attract unwanted attention. Amado had built a fortune estimated at more than $25 billion, but money on that scale could not remain entirely hidden. Luxury properties, private jets, and investments abroad risked exposure. He was said to have laundered vast sums through banks in Mexico, Colombia, and even Europe, but financial institutions themselves were coming under greater international scrutiny. Each new regulation, each tightened loophole, was another obstacle for maintaining his invisible empire. Violence, too, crept closer to his carefully constructed walls. Though Amado avoided open warfare, his enemies were not so restrained. Rumors spread of assassination attempts, of plots by rivals to eliminate him, of hired killers waiting for the right opportunity. Juárez itself, long a relatively stable hub under his quiet rule, began to feel the tremors of instability. Smaller gangs sought to challenge the order, and violence between factions left corpses in the streets. Amado had once prided himself on maintaining order in his city, but absolute control was slipping. The weight of leadership grew heavier. Unlike other cartel bosses, Amado was not content to be a violent figurehead. He micromanaged operations, personally overseeing logistics, alliances, and finances. This hands-on style had fueled his rise, but it also drained him. The higher he climbed, the more responsibilities pressed down. Sleep became rare, trust rarer still, and every whisper of betrayal became a source of anxiety. Even his health began to show signs of strain, as constant stress and paranoia took their toll. What made his downfall almost inevitable, however, was the combination of government pressure and his own humanity. As Mexican and U.S. agencies closed in, Amado became increasingly aware that his face, once rarely known, was now appearing on wanted posters and international reports. He could no longer move as freely as before. Airports, once his empire's symbol of power, became places of vulnerability. Every landing, every takeoff, carried the risk of capture. His anonymity was fading, and with it, his greatest advantage. Some accounts suggest that around this time, Amado began considering drastic steps to preserve his freedom. He allegedly explored the idea of altering his appearance through plastic surgery, a desperate attempt to escape the growing pressure. This choice, whether born of paranoia, practicality, or both, would ultimately lead to his tragic end. But even before that fateful decision, it was clear, the empire of El Señor de los Cielos was entering its most fragile phase. The myth of invincibility that had surrounded him for years was beginning to fracture. Enemies circled from without, betrayal whispered from within, and governments applied pressure from above. Amado, the man who once ruled the skies with silence and precision, was now increasingly weighed down by the turbulence of his own success. The skies that had lifted him to power were darkening, and though he still flew higher than any of his rivals, the world was waiting for gravity to claim its due. It was the paradox of all great cartels: the higher one rises, the harder the fall. And for Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the fall would be as sudden and dramatic as his ascent had been methodical. At the height of his paranoia, he was no longer the calm architect of invisible empires but a hunted man, burdened by billions, haunted by betrayal, and pursued by governments that would no longer allow him to soar unchallenged. By 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes had reached a point where his empire, wealth, and reputation left him with few places to hide. The quiet, calculated approach that had once protected him was no longer enough. His face was known, his movements tracked, and his name whispered in political and law enforcement circles from Mexico City to Washington. For a man who had built his fortune on invisibility, the spotlight was unbearable. Every flight he took, every meeting he attended, carried the risk of recognition and arrest. It was in this climate of fear and desperation that Amado began to consider an extraordinary solution: changing his very identity through surgery. Plastic surgery was not unheard of in the world of organized crime. Traffickers and fugitives had long attempted to alter their appearances to evade capture. Some dyed their hair, others grew beards, and a few had even undergone surgical procedures to disguise themselves. But Amado's plan was different in scope and ambition. He didn't want minor alterations, he wanted a complete transformation. New face, new body, new man. To him, it was the only way to erase the growing target painted on his back. Whispers spread among his inner circle that Amado had contacted a network of private doctors willing to perform the surgeries in secret. He trusted few people with the plan, knowing that any leak could prove fatal. The chosen location, according to reports, was a private clinic in Mexico City, a discreet facility that promised luxury, privacy, and above all, silence. The idea was simple yet audacious: undergo a series of operations that would make him unrecognizable to authorities, then vanish into anonymity, free to live out his days without the looming shadow of extradition or assassination. But surgery, especially the kind he sought, was a dangerous gamble. The procedures involved were invasive: liposuction, facial reconstruction, and other alterations that carried significant risks, especially in the 1990s when surgical safety was less advanced. For most people, the danger might have been a deterrent. For Amado, it was a risk worth taking. He had faced gunfire, betrayal, and government manhunts. A hospital bed seemed almost tame in comparison. What he didn't fully calculate, however, was that surgery was not a battlefield he could control. Accounts suggest that Amado entered the clinic in early July of 1997. The atmosphere was heavy with secrecy. Windows were shuttered, staff were sworn to silence, and the operation was scheduled to take place overnight, away from prying eyes. Only a select few knew the true identity of the patient. To them, he was not the Lord of the Skies but simply a wealthy man seeking cosmetic improvement. Yet among those few were men whose loyalty was questionable, and it remains uncertain whether betrayal, incompetence, or sheer misfortune led to what happened next. The surgery began. Hours stretched on as the team of doctors worked on Amado's body, reshaping features, removing fat, attempting to sculpt a new face for a man who wished to disappear. But somewhere along the line, things went catastrophically wrong. Reports differ on the exact cause. Some claim Amado suffered complications from anesthesia, others that a botched liposuction triggered a fatal reaction. What is clear is that his body could not withstand the strain. The man who had ruled the skies, who had evaded governments and rivals for decades, lay vulnerable on an operating table, undone not by bullets but by the cold instruments of a surgical team. When he died, panic rippled through the clinic. The doctors, suddenly aware of the magnitude of their mistake, scrambled to decide what to do. Killing the most powerful drug trafficker in Mexico, whether intentionally or by accident, was a death sentence in itself. Soon after, 2 of the doctors involved in the operation were found dead, their bodies stuffed into steel drums and left as a grim warning. The message was clear: Amado's death would not go unanswered, and loose ends would be tied up, one way or another. News of his passing spread quickly, though at first it was met with disbelief. Many refused to accept that the Lord of the Skies, with all his resources and cunning, could die in such a mundane and human way. Some believed the story was a fabrication, a smokescreen designed to allow him to vanish under a new identity. After all, what better cover could there be than dying on the operating table, only to slip away unnoticed? Rumors of sightings continued for years, feeding the myth that Amado had outsmarted death itself. Yet the official story remained: Amado Carrillo Fuentes died on July 4, 1997, during a botched plastic surgery operation. His death marked the end of an era. For Mexico, it was both a victory and a new source of chaos. On one hand, the most powerful trafficker in the country was gone, seemingly without a single shot fired. On the other hand, his empire, vast and lucrative, was suddenly leaderless, sparking battles among rivals eager to claim the throne. For Amado's family and allies, the moment was one of grief, but also of calculation. His death was not just personal, it was political, financial, and symbolic. The man who had ruled the skies with precision and discretion had fallen victim to a moment of vulnerability. The myth of invincibility shattered, leaving behind an empire in flux and a legacy that blurred the line between fact and legend. The image of Amado lying on that operating table has lingered for decades, not because of the clinical details, but because of the irony it represented. A man who could buy fleets of planes, corrupt governments, and outwit the world's most powerful agencies could not buy more time for himself. His bid for a new face, a new life, became the final chapter of his story. And yet, in the stillness of that clinic, in the shadows of whispered rumors, one question remained: did the Lord of the Skies truly die that night, or did he succeed in escaping once more, vanishing into the anonymity he so desperately craved? The truth, perhaps, remains suspended somewhere between the silence of an operating room and the myth of a man who once ruled the heavens. The death of Amado Carrillo Fuentes in July of 1997 sent shockwaves through Mexico and beyond, not only because of the man he was but because of the bizarre, almost anticlimactic circumstances surrounding it. A titan of organized crime, the Lord of the Skies had not fallen in a hail of bullets or in a spectacular showdown with the law. Instead, the man who commanded billions and orchestrated global drug routes had perished in the sterile quiet of a surgical clinic. But the story did not end there. In many ways, it was only beginning, for what followed was a spectacle that blurred the line between mourning, myth, and intimidation. When news of his death first surfaced, disbelief was the most common reaction. Many, including rivals, allies, and government officials, simply could not accept that Amado had died on an operating table. It seemed too mundane, too fragile an end for a man of his stature. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some insisted that the body was a decoy, that Amado had staged his death to live freely under a new identity. Others claimed the government itself had fabricated the story, hoping to appease U.S. pressure while secretly cutting deals with the elusive trafficker. For ordinary citizens, the news felt like a legend breaking apart, as if a shadowy figure who had ruled from the skies had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but questions. What silenced the speculation, at least temporarily, was the funeral. Amado's body was returned to his family in Chihuahua, and what followed was one of the most surreal displays of wealth, fear, and mourning in Mexico's modern history. His coffin, unlike anything seen before, was encased in reinforced steel and heavily guarded, almost as if the man within still needed protection even in death. Thousands attended the funeral, including family members, associates, and curious onlookers who wanted to glimpse the end of a legend. Soldiers, police, and cartel enforcers all mingled uneasily in the same space, their presence a reminder of just how deeply Amado's influence had penetrated every level of Mexican society. The display of wealth was staggering. Expensive floral arrangements covered the streets, caravans of luxury cars escorted the coffin, and mourners carried themselves with a blend of reverence and fear. Some cried openly, others whispered prayers, while many kept their eyes low, aware that even in death, Amado's name carried danger. The funeral was not only a farewell but also a declaration. It was a reminder to rivals and authorities alike that Amado Carrillo Fuentes had been more than a trafficker, he had been an institution, a man whose reach extended into politics, business, and communities across Mexico. But the spectacle also deepened the mystery. Photographs of his embalmed body circulated, showing a face distorted and swollen from the botched surgery. For some, the images were proof of his death. For others, they were simply more fuel for conspiracy. How could anyone be certain that the man in the coffin was truly Amado? Why was the coffin sealed with such intensity? Why were the doctors who had operated on him later found dead? Every detail seemed to raise new questions instead of answering old ones, feeding the myth of a trafficker who might still be alive somewhere, watching events unfold from the shadows. The funeral also carried profound consequences for his empire. In the underworld, a leader's death is never just a personal loss, it is a signal of weakness, an opening for rivals to strike, and a call to arms for lieutenants eager to claim power. The Juárez Cartel, once firmly under Amado's control, now faced uncertainty. His brother Vicente Carrillo Fuentes was quick to step in as successor, but he lacked the aura, vision, and calming authority of Amado. Rivals sensed blood in the water, and what followed was a new wave of violence as factions vied for dominance. The Mexican government, too, seized on the moment. For officials long accused of corruption and complacency, Amado's death was an opportunity to present a victory to both domestic and international audiences. Press conferences declared the end of the Lord of the Skies, portraying his passing as proof of progress in the war against drugs. Yet beneath the surface, officials knew the truth. Amado's death might have eliminated a single man, but it did nothing to dismantle the structures, networks, and corrupt systems he had left behind. In fact, without his steady hand at the helm, violence was almost certain to escalate. For communities touched by Amado's reign, the funeral left an emotional imprint. In Juárez, many saw him as both protector and predator. He had brought wealth and jobs through construction, investments, and community projects, but he had also brought fear, violence, and addiction. His death forced people to reflect on the paradox of his legacy, a man who destroyed lives on one side of the border while sustaining families on the other. Some mourned him as a benefactor, others cursed his name, and most simply lived with the uneasy silence of knowing that life under his successors might be far bloodier. Even in death, Amado continued to command respect through fear. His associates ensured that anyone who betrayed him in life or death would face consequences, as demonstrated by the murders of the doctors. His coffin became less a symbol of closure than of intimidation, a reminder that the Lord of the Skies still cast a long shadow over Mexico. To betray him, even posthumously, was to invite retribution. The funeral ended, but the questions did not. Was Amado truly buried in that steel coffin, or had the entire event been an elaborate deception? Did he die helpless under anesthesia, or had he managed one final escape? And if he was truly gone, what would become of the empire he had so carefully built? These open questions lingered, haunting the streets of Mexico City, Chihuahua, and Juárez, and echoing across the border into the United States. The truth of Amado's death may never be universally accepted, but his funeral crystallized the strange duality of his life, a man both feared and admired, mourned and doubted, gone and yet still present in whispers and shadows. His burial was not just the end of a life, it was the beginning of a myth, a transformation from flesh and blood trafficker into a legend whose story would be told for decades. And in that legend, the image of the sealed coffin under heavy guard, watched over by mourners who dared not speak too loudly, became a lasting symbol. For the Lord of the Skies, even death was not an end but another chapter, written in steel, silence, and the eternal uncertainty of whether he had truly fallen or had taken flight one final time. The death of Amado Carrillo Fuentes created a void that could not easily be filled. For years, the Juárez Cartel had operated with an unusual degree of stability, largely because of Amado's leadership style. He had been calm, pragmatic, and deeply invested in maintaining balance. Unlike many cartel bosses, he avoided unnecessary wars and focused on efficiency. His death, however, shattered that equilibrium. Suddenly, the cartel was without its architect, and the question loomed, who would inherit the empire of the Lord of the Skies? Almost immediately, attention turned to Amado's brother, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes. Known within the organization as El Viceroy, Vicente had long been at his brother's side, managing parts of the operation and ensuring loyalty among lieutenants. Yet there was a stark difference between the two men. Where Amado was patient and calculating, Vicente was seen as more ruthless, more paranoid, and less capable of maintaining the delicate networks of trust that Amado had cultivated. Still, bloodlines mattered, and Vicente's claim was stronger than that of any outsider. Within days, he stepped into the role of leader, determined to preserve what his brother had built. But leadership in the world of cartels is never uncontested. Other powerful figures within the Juárez cartel had their own ambitions. Lieutenants who had grown wealthy and powerful under Amado now eyed opportunities to elevate themselves. The death of a leader often sparks fragmentation, and whispers of betrayal began to spread almost as quickly as the news of Amado's passing. Some factions remained loyal to the Carrillo Fuentes family, while others secretly negotiated with rivals, sensing a chance to break free from Juárez's control. The situation was made even more volatile by external forces. Rivals such as the Tijuana cartel, led by the Arellano Felix brothers, saw Amado's death as an opening. For years, they had lived in the shadow of his logistical genius. Now, they sought to expand their own influence, sending emissaries, assassins, and bribes into territories that had once been firmly under Juárez's grasp. The Gulf Cartel, too, pushed to exploit the chaos, attempting to capture routes that had been carefully guarded by Amado's loyal network of pilots and smugglers. Vicente found himself at the center of a storm. To assert his authority, he leaned heavily on intimidation and violence. His leadership style was marked by public displays of brutality meant to send a message: the Juárez cartel was still strong, and challenges would be met with blood. Murders surged in Juárez and Chihuahua as Vicente sought to eliminate rivals within and beyond the organization. Bodies appeared on roadsides, gunfights erupted in neighborhoods, and the fragile sense of order that Amado had maintained dissolved almost overnight. The Mexican government, watching closely, recognized the shift. Under Amado, corruption had been efficient, quiet, and predictable. With Vicente, the corruption remained, but the violence spilled into the streets in ways that could not be ignored. U.S. pressure continued to mount, and Mexican authorities found themselves caught between attempting to rein in the chaos and profiting from the instability. The war on drugs, always more theater than reality, now had new material in the form of cartel battles spilling across borders. For the people of Ciudad Juárez, the change was palpable. During Amado's reign, violence existed but was often controlled, kept within the confines of cartel politics. Under Vicente, the violence became more indiscriminate. Innocents were caught in the crossfire, and the city's reputation as a relatively stable trafficking hub began to crumble. Businesses suffered, fear spread, and the once pragmatic rule of the Lord of the Skies was replaced by the uncertainty of factional conflict. Amado's death also reignited old rivalries with Colombian suppliers. For years, he had been the favored partner of Colombian cartels, especially after the fall of Escobar. His efficiency and reliability had made him indispensable. Vicente, however, lacked the same credibility. Colombians questioned whether he could deliver with the same precision. As faith in his leadership wavered, Colombian organizations explored deals with other Mexican cartels, including the Sinaloa cartel, which was rising rapidly under Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán and Ismael El Mayo Zambada. This erosion of trust placed Vicente in a precarious position. To maintain dominance, he needed not only to control his own lieutenants but also to reassure Colombian suppliers, bribe Mexican officials, and outmaneuver ambitious rivals. Each demand pulled him in a different direction, and each failure weakened his grip. The Juárez cartel was still powerful, but its strength rested more on inertia and fear than on the careful planning that Amado had once provided. Ironically, Amado's greatest strength, his ability to keep a low profile, became Vicente's greatest weakness. The Lord of the Skies had built his empire by avoiding unnecessary attention. Vicente, by contrast, could not avoid it. The violence of his leadership, the instability of his alliances, and the chaos within his own ranks drew scrutiny from governments, journalists, and rival cartels alike. In attempting to hold on to his brother's empire, Vicente unintentionally dismantled the very secrecy that had made it so formidable. For many within Juárez, there was a sense of nostalgia for Amado almost immediately after his death. Though he had been a trafficker, a criminal whose fortune was built on cocaine, he had provided a strange kind of stability. With him gone, chaos reigned. His funeral had been a spectacle, but it was what followed, the blood in the streets, the endless power struggles, that defined his absence. His empire had not simply passed to his brother, it had fractured, bled, and turned inward. The Lord of the Skies had risen because of discipline, vision, and silence. The empire he left behind began to collapse under the weight of ego, ambition, and noise. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes inherited the title of leader, but he did not inherit the qualities that had once made Juárez the crown jewel of trafficking routes. From this point forward, the Juárez cartel was no longer a shadowy empire of efficiency. It was a battlefield, and the war for its control would stain northern Mexico with years of violence. The legacy of Amado became clearer with every passing month of chaos. In life, he had commanded respect. In death, he revealed just how irreplaceable he had been. And as rivals closed in and his brother struggled to maintain control, the question was no longer whether Juárez would survive, it was how much blood would be spilled before the cartel's inevitable decline. After the death of Amado Carrillo Fuentes and the shaky transition of power to Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, the Mexican underworld entered a new and volatile chapter. The Juárez cartel, once the most organized and stable trafficking empire in Mexico, began to weaken under the weight of factionalism, distrust, and external pressure. Into this growing vacuum stepped the Sinaloa cartel, led by Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and their allies. For years, the Sinaloa cartel had operated in the shadows of larger organizations, but the collapse of Amado's carefully crafted empire provided them with the opportunity to emerge as the most ambitious and aggressive force in the drug trade. El Chapo had escaped from prison in 2001, and his return to the criminal world sent shockwaves across Mexico. Even before his escape, he was known as a cunning strategist with an unrelenting hunger for power. Unlike Amado, whose leadership was rooted in calm efficiency, El Chapo thrived on chaos. He was willing to embrace violence as a tool of expansion, and his vision for Sinaloa was not just to control trafficking routes but to dominate them entirely. For him, the weakening Juárez cartel was not just a competitor, it was prey. The first cracks appeared in the border city of Ciudad Juárez itself. For decades, Juárez had been the crown jewel of trafficking routes into the United States. Its strategic location, directly across from El Paso, Texas, made it a gateway for billions of dollars worth of cocaine, marijuana, and methamphetamine. Amado had maintained this route through careful negotiation and selective violence. Under Vicente, however, corruption was mismanaged, and loyalty eroded. El Chapo sensed that if he could seize Juárez, Sinaloa would have the most lucrative corridor in the world under its control. The ensuing conflict became known as the Battle for Juárez, one of the bloodiest episodes in Mexico's modern history. From 2008 to 2012, the city descended into near-total chaos as the Juárez cartel, under Vicente's leadership, fought desperately to retain control of the plaza against the advancing forces of Sinaloa. Thousands of people were killed, including cartel operatives, police officers, and countless civilians caught in the crossfire. Entire neighborhoods turned into battlefields. Families fled, businesses closed, and Juárez earned the grim reputation of being the most dangerous city on earth. What made the Sinaloa cartel especially dangerous was its flexibility. El Chapo and El Mayo were willing to forge alliances with smaller groups, subcontract violence to gangs, and bribe officials at every level of government. Their network was fluid, adaptable, and relentless. They recruited local street gangs in Juárez, offering them money, weapons, and protection in exchange for loyalty. This decentralized strategy allowed Sinaloa to multiply its reach while keeping its leadership insulated from direct retaliation. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, meanwhile, clung to power with brutal methods, but his leadership style only deepened divisions. The Juárez cartel relied heavily on La Línea, its armed enforcement wing composed largely of corrupt former police officers. While they were effective at inflicting terror, they lacked the coordination and resources of Sinaloa's ever-expanding army. The war became one of attrition, and over time, Juárez simply could not match the financial and organizational strength of Sinaloa. Beyond Juárez, the rise of the Sinaloa cartel was reshaping the entire Mexican underworld. In states like Sinaloa, Durango, and Sonora, they established strongholds, protecting themselves with a mix of fear and patronage. They positioned themselves as the heirs to Amado's vision of large-scale trafficking but infused it with a far more aggressive, expansionist ideology. El Chapo, unlike Amado, relished the spotlight. His name spread not only through Mexico but across the world. He became a figure of both fascination and terror, an escape artist, a narco kingpin, and a symbol of the Mexican state's inability to control its own territory. The fall of Juárez's dominance also marked the beginning of a broader reshaping of cartel geopolitics. For years, Amado had been the balancing force between different organizations, using diplomacy to prevent full-scale wars. His death left that balance shattered, and El Chapo stepped into the chaos with little interest in peace. The Sinaloa cartel launched offensives against not only Juárez but also the Tijuana cartel, the Beltran Leyva organization, and even clashed at times with the Gulf cartel and Los Zetas. Each conflict left a trail of blood, but each victory expanded their reach. The Colombian suppliers, once loyal to Amado, shifted their allegiance. They found in Sinaloa a reliable new partner, an organization willing to move massive quantities of cocaine with ruthless efficiency. Colombian groups such as the Norte del Valle cartel and later dissident factions of the FARC cultivated ties with Sinaloa, ensuring that El Chapo's empire had a steady pipeline of product to feed the insatiable U.S. market. The rise of Sinaloa was not just a Mexican story, it was a hemispheric transformation of the drug trade. For ordinary people in Mexico, the consequences were devastating. The violence that erupted during the battle for Juárez became a template for conflicts across the country. Cities like Culiacán, Monterrey, Reynosa, and Acapulco experienced similar waves of brutality as cartels fought for territory. The Mexican government, pressured by the United States, launched militarized operations against cartels, but these interventions often backfired, escalating the bloodshed rather than containing it. What made the Sinaloa cartel so resilient was not only its military strength but also its ability to act like a multinational corporation. They diversified their product line, moving not just cocaine and marijuana but also heroin and, later, synthetic drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl. They invested in tunnels, semi-submersibles, and even legitimate businesses to launder money. They bribed politicians, military officers, and police chiefs, ensuring that they had protection from the very institutions meant to stop them. In this sense, the rise of Sinaloa was the direct mirror of the fall of Juárez. Amado Carrillo Fuentes had built his empire on discretion, logistics, and control. His brother Vicente failed to preserve it, relying instead on intimidation and fear. El Chapo and El Mayo built theirs on aggression, expansion, and adaptability. Where Juárez collapsed under pressure, Sinaloa thrived in chaos. By the mid-2010s, the transformation was complete. Juárez was a shadow of its former self, and the Sinaloa cartel had become the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world. Its rise was fueled by the void left by Amado's death, but its staying power came from a leadership that understood how to weaponize both violence and corruption on an unprecedented scale. The story of Sinaloa's rise is inseparable from Juárez's decline. One empire crumbled under the weight of its leader's absence, while another emerged to claim its throne, plunging Mexico into a new era of cartel wars that would shape the country for decades. After the decline of the Juárez cartel and the unstoppable rise of the Sinaloa cartel, the landscape of organized crime in Mexico became even more complex with the emergence of new and extremely violent players. Among them were the Gulf Cartel and their paramilitary offshoot, Los Zetas, two forces that would forever change the dynamics of drug trafficking and violence in the country. While Amado Carrillo Fuentes had built his empire on logistics and diplomacy, these groups embraced raw brutality, militarized tactics, and a willingness to unleash terror on both rivals and civilians. Their ascent marked a new era in Mexico's narco history, one defined by public displays of violence, unimaginable cruelty, and battles that seemed less like traditional crime wars and more like insurgencies. The Gulf Cartel was not a new name in the Mexican underworld. Based in Tamaulipas, along the northeastern border with Texas, it had existed since the early 20th century, first involved in alcohol smuggling during Prohibition and later evolving into one of the country's most powerful trafficking organizations. By the late 1990s, under the leadership of Ojael Cardenas Guillen, the Gulf Cartel grew to prominence. Cardenas was aggressive, ambitious, and ruthless, but he also understood that in order to maintain control over lucrative border crossings, he needed an army unlike anything Mexico had seen before. This need gave birth to Los Zetas, originally composed of elite soldiers from Mexico's special forces who had deserted the army in search of greater wealth. These men were highly trained in counterinsurgency, guerrilla warfare, and intelligence gathering, skills they now turned toward organized crime. At first, they served as the enforcement arm of the Gulf Cartel, carrying out kidnappings, assassinations, and territorial defense with terrifying precision. But in time, Los Zetas grew too powerful and too independent, eventually breaking away to form their own cartel. Their methods shocked the world. Unlike Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who had relied on subtlety and control, Los Zetas embraced violence as their brand. They executed enemies in public, left bodies hanging from bridges, and filmed gruesome acts as warnings. Their strategy was psychological as much as it was physical, instilling fear not only in rival cartels but also in the communities where they operated. To many Mexicans, Los Zetas represented a new kind of criminal group, less like traffickers and more like warlords. The Gulf Cartel, even after the split, remained a formidable force. Their control of Tamaulipas gave them direct access to the United States, especially cities like Brownsville, McAllen, and Laredo, Texas. Their proximity to major highways and distribution hubs made them a vital player in the northbound flow of cocaine, marijuana, and heroin. They also became notorious for their kidnapping and extortion operations, further embedding themselves in the daily lives of border communities. As Sinaloa pushed its influence westward, and Juárez crumbled under internal weakness, the Gulf Zetas alliance, and later rivalry, dominated the east. For a time, their combined power rivaled even that of the Sinaloa cartel. Their military-style tactics, advanced weaponry, and sheer willingness to escalate conflict made them unpredictable and dangerous. The split between the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas came to define much of Mexico's violence in the 2000s and early 2010s. By 2010, open war had broken out between the two groups, turning Tamaulipas and Nuevo Leon into epicenters of bloodshed. Battles erupted in Reynosa, Matamoros, and Monterrey, cities that had once been relatively calm compared to Juárez or Tijuana. Civilians lived in constant fear, with shootouts erupting in broad daylight, entire highways shut down by blockades, and mass killings leaving communities traumatized. Los Zetas distinguished themselves not just by their cruelty but also by their diversification. Unlike Sinaloa or Juárez, who relied primarily on trafficking, Los Zetas expanded into oil theft, human smuggling, piracy, and extortion. Their model was less a drug cartel and more a sprawling criminal enterprise that touched nearly every aspect of life in the regions they controlled. This made them harder to dismantle because their power was not tied to a single revenue stream. Even if a shipment of cocaine was seized, they could rely on fuel theft or extortion to keep their operations afloat. Meanwhile, the Gulf Cartel clung to its trafficking routes but began to lose ground. The loss of Ojael Cardenas Guillen, who was captured in 2003 and later extradited to the United States, left the organization fractured. Leadership disputes and the war with Los Zetas weakened them, but their legacy remained strong enough to keep them in the fight. They adapted by forming alliances, sometimes even with former rivals, in a desperate attempt to survive. The rise of Los Zetas also forced the Mexican government to escalate its response. Unlike Amado Carrillo Fuentes, whose corruption and quiet negotiations allowed him to operate in relative peace, the sheer brutality of Los Zetas drew international attention. Massacres like the San Fernando killings, where dozens of migrants were executed, horrified the world. It became impossible for authorities to ignore. The Mexican state launched military offensives, supported by U.S. intelligence and funding through initiatives like the Merida program. Yet, much like with the Sinaloa cartel, each strike only fragmented the group further, creating splinter cells that were often even more violent and unpredictable. In the broader picture of Mexico's underworld, the emergence of the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas created a three-way balance of terror with Sinaloa and the remnants of Juárez. Each fought bitterly for plazas, and the violence spread across the country like wildfire. What had once been relatively contained to border cities like Juárez or Tijuana now engulfed vast regions of Mexico. From Tamaulipas in the east to Michoacán in the west, cartel wars erupted in towns and cities that had never before seen such bloodshed. The legacy of this period is one of escalation. If Amado Carrillo Fuentes represented the era of discretion and logistical sophistication, Los Zetas embodied the era of spectacle and terror. Their public brutality changed the way cartels operated, forcing others, Sinaloa included, to adapt or risk losing influence. While Amado had sought to avoid attention, the Zetas thrived on it, using horror itself as a tool of control. By the mid-2010s, Los Zetas had begun to fracture under government pressure and internal disputes, but their influence remained undeniable. They had rewritten the rules of cartel warfare, and their legacy of violence still haunts Mexico. The Gulf Cartel, weakened but persistent, survived in pockets, its power ebbing and flowing depending on leadership struggles and shifting alliances. Together, their rise marked the beginning of an era where cartels were no longer just smugglers, they were militarized organizations capable of challenging the state itself. For the people of Mexico, this was a turning point, where the line between organized crime and open warfare blurred. For the world, it was a reminder that the collapse of one empire, like that of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, often creates the conditions for something even more dangerous to emerge. When Vicente Fox took office in the year 2000, he became the first Mexican president in over 70 years not to come from the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI. His victory was celebrated as a new dawn of democracy and reform, but in the shadows of Mexico's borderlands and highways, another story was unfolding. The drug cartels that had flourished under decades of PRI rule, where corruption and backroom deals kept violence in check, now found themselves facing a government that promised transparency but struggled to control them. Fox's presidency would mark the beginning of a new phase in the so-called war on drugs, a campaign that would later intensify under Felipe Calderón and forever change the face of Mexico. By the time Fox entered office, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was long dead, the Juárez Cartel was in decline, and the Sinaloa Cartel had emerged as a dominant force. At the same time, the Gulf Cartel and its brutal paramilitary wing, Los Zetas, were rising with a strategy based on terror. The old balance of power Amado had carefully maintained through diplomacy had shattered, and in its place, Mexico descended into open warfare. For Fox, this meant dealing with an increasingly fragmented underworld, one where rival cartels no longer respected the unwritten rules of restraint. Fox's administration initially tried to project strength. In 2001, however, a shocking event undermined his credibility. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, leader of the Sinaloa cartel, escaped from a high-security prison in Jalisco. Officially, the story was that he hid inside a laundry cart and was wheeled out of the facility by corrupt guards. The escape made headlines around the world and revealed the staggering reach of cartel corruption. For the Mexican public, it was a humiliation. For El Chapo, it was liberation, and the beginning of his campaign to turn the Sinaloa cartel into a global powerhouse. During Fox's 6-year presidency, drug violence surged, but it was still seen as containable. Cartels fought vicious battles in places like Tamaulipas, Nuevo Laredo, and Juárez, but the scale had not yet reached the nationwide chaos that would come later. The government attempted to strike deals quietly, relying on local governors, police chiefs, and the military to manage the conflicts. But the cracks were already showing. With the Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas, Sinaloa, and remnants of Juárez all fighting for dominance, bloodshed was escalating, and civilians were increasingly caught in the crossfire. When Felipe Calderón took office in December 2006, he inherited a country on the brink of collapse in certain regions. Calderón, a member of the conservative PAN party, made a fateful decision just days into his presidency. He declared an all-out war on the cartels. Dressed in military fatigues, he announced that Mexico would not surrender its streets to organized crime. His administration deployed tens of thousands of soldiers across the country, marking the most militarized anti-drug campaign in Mexico's history. At first, Calderón's strategy seemed bold and decisive. Federal troops poured into Michoacán, his home state, in an attempt to dismantle La Familia Michoacana, a cartel that mixed drug trafficking with pseudo-religious ideology. From there, the campaign spread to Tamaulipas, Chihuahua, and Baja California. But instead of weakening the cartels, the war fractured them further. Leaders were captured or killed, but their organizations splintered into smaller, more violent factions. Each new vacuum became a spark for even greater bloodshed. One of Calderón's most famous victories came in 2007 with the arrest of Ojael Cardenas Guillen, head of the Gulf Cartel. But his capture unleashed chaos, as Los Zetas split away entirely, turning former allies into bitter enemies. What followed was a reign of terror in northeastern Mexico, with towns and highways becoming battlegrounds. Civilians were massacred, migrants kidnapped, and public executions staged as warnings. Calderon's war coincided with the height of the battle for Juárez. From 2008 to 2012, Ciudad Juárez became the most violent city in the world, with thousands of killings linked to the struggle between the Juárez Cartel, Sinaloa, and their local enforcers. Federal police and military patrols tried to stem the violence, but the city descended into a state of siege. Businesses closed, families fled, and entire neighborhoods were abandoned. The bloodshed was so relentless that morgues overflowed, and Juárez became a global symbol of Mexico's narco war. The militarization of the conflict also drew heavy criticism. Soldiers often committed human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, and torture. Communities that had once feared cartels now found themselves trapped between criminal groups and the very state meant to protect them. Instead of restoring order, Calderon's war deepened mistrust of the government and exposed how deeply cartels had infiltrated political and security institutions. Meanwhile, the cartels themselves adapted. Sinaloa, under El Chapo and El Mayo, thrived in the chaos. They used the government's pressure on rivals to their advantage, moving swiftly into territories left weakened by military operations. Los Zetas, fragmented but ruthless, expanded across vast swathes of territory, from Veracruz to Coahuila, leaving massacres in their wake. The Beltran-Leyva brothers, once loyal allies of Sinaloa, split off in 2008 after a betrayal, igniting yet another war. Each new conflict added layers of bloodshed and confusion to a map of violence that stretched across nearly every state in Mexico. By the end of Calderon's presidency in 2012, the toll was staggering. Over 60,000 people were dead, and tens of thousands more were missing. Entire regions lived under cartel rule, where gunmen enforced curfews, collected extortion payments, and acted as de facto governments. The United States, deeply concerned about the violence spilling over the border, increased its involvement, providing intelligence, funding, and training. Yet, despite billions of dollars spent and countless arrests made, the cartels remained as powerful as ever, if not more so. The war on drugs under Fox and Calderon marked a turning point in Mexican history. For decades, cartels like Amado Carrillo Fuentes' Juárez organization had operated under a kind of shadow equilibrium, violent but controlled, brutal but predictable. That equilibrium collapsed under the weight of militarized confrontation. What replaced it was chaos, a hydra-headed conflict where killing one cartel leader produced three more, and where violence became the defining feature of everyday life in Mexico. Looking back, many Mexicans describe this period as the moment when the country crossed a line from which it has never truly returned. The war that began with promises of restoring order instead unleashed waves of violence still felt today. And within this storm, the ghost of Amado Carrillo Fuentes lingers as a haunting reminder of an era when cartels operated differently, quieter, more calculated, yet just as destructive. By the time Felipe Calderon's drug war reached its bloodiest years, the Juárez Cartel, once the unrivaled empire of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, was already fighting for survival. After Amado's sudden death in 1997, his younger brother Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, known as El Viceroy, stepped into the vacuum. For a time, Vicente managed to hold on to the cartel's prized jewel, control over Ciudad Juárez, the most lucrative trafficking corridor into the United States. But unlike Amado, who had been cautious, strategic, and diplomatic, Vicente ruled through fear and intimidation, lacking the vision that had made his brother, the Lord of the Skies. Vicente's reign was defined by constant bloodshed. The Juárez cartel's survival strategy relied heavily on its enforcement wing, La Línea, composed largely of corrupt former police officers, and the Barrio Azteca street gang, which handled much of the local violence and extortion. These groups became infamous for kidnappings, executions, and public displays of brutality. But while they instilled fear, they could not match the organizational power or financial resources of their rivals. The cartel's reliance on terror alienated the very communities it needed for support, eroding its local base even as the war with the Sinaloa cartel escalated. The years between 2008 and 2012 marked the battle for Juárez, one of the most violent episodes in Mexico's modern history. Ciudad Juárez, once known as a bustling industrial city with booming maquiladoras, factories that supplied the U.S. market, became a war zone. Every corner, street, and neighborhood turned into contested ground. Daily shootouts claimed lives in broad daylight, cars were riddled with bullets, and families lived under a constant curfew of fear. Entire businesses closed, and thousands of residents fled north across the border to El Paso, Texas. At the peak of the violence, Juárez was recording more than 3,000 murders per year, making it the most dangerous city in the world. The scale of death was so great that morgues overflowed, mass graves were uncovered, and the city's reputation transformed from an industrial hub into a symbol of Mexico's narco war. Newspapers filled daily with images of blood-soaked crime scenes, and the air was thick with the smell of fear. For every execution carried out by La Línea or Barrio Azteca, Sinaloa responded with equal or greater force, ensuring that the killing never stopped. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, El Viceroy, ruled through paranoia. He trusted no one fully and executed suspected traitors, even within his own organization. He sought protection through corruption, paying off police and politicians, but the money that had once flowed so freely under Amado began to dwindle. With Colombian suppliers now favoring Sinaloa, the Juárez cartel struggled to maintain its pipelines of cocaine. What shipments it did manage to control came at great cost, both in bribes and blood. One of Vicente's most infamous strategies was unleashing waves of violence against civilians to spread fear. Car bombings, once rare in Mexico's cartel wars, appeared in Juárez under his watch. These acts, intended to intimidate rivals and authorities, only deepened public hatred for the Juárez cartel. Unlike Amado, who had sought to avoid unnecessary attention, Vicente embraced notoriety, but it backfired spectacularly. The Mexican government, already engaged in Calderón's militarized drug war, eventually turned its full attention to Juárez. Federal police and military units flooded the city. Checkpoints were set up, patrols combed neighborhoods, and joint task forces hunted down cartel operatives. The presence of thousands of soldiers brought a temporary sense of security, but it also led to human rights abuses and deepened the atmosphere of mistrust. By the early 2010s, the war had taken its toll on the Juárez cartel. The Sinaloa cartel, with its far greater resources, forged alliances with local gangs and steadily chipped away at Juárez's control. Slowly but surely, Sinaloa established dominance over the plaza. Businesses, politicians, and corrupt officials who once answered to Vicente switched their loyalty to El Chapo and El Mayo. The writing was on the wall, the Juárez cartel was collapsing. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes's paranoia reached new heights. He lived in constant fear of betrayal, moving between safe houses and using layers of protection to avoid capture. Unlike his brother Amado, whose charisma and vision had inspired loyalty, Vicente inspired only fear, and fear is brittle. Many of his top lieutenants defected, fled, or were killed. The once mighty cartel that had controlled billions of dollars in drug flows became a shadow of itself, a fractured network struggling to survive. In October 2014, Vicente's downfall became official. After years on the run, he was captured by Mexican federal forces in Torreon, Coahuila. The arrest was announced with great fanfare, presented as a major victory in the war on drugs. El Viceroy, once considered one of Mexico's most powerful kingpins, appeared tired, aged, and defeated when displayed to the press. His capture symbolized the end of an era, not just for the Juárez cartel but for the Carrillo Fuentes dynasty itself. The aftermath of Vicente's arrest was fragmentation. Without a strong leader, the Juárez cartel splintered into smaller groups, some still operating under the La Línea banner, others devolving into street-level gangs that relied more on extortion and kidnapping than international trafficking. Juárez itself slowly stabilized as Sinaloa tightened its grip, but the scars of the war remained visible in abandoned neighborhoods, shuttered businesses, and the memories of families who had lost loved ones. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes now sits in prison, his empire long gone. His rule represents the tragic arc of Juárez, from Amado's logistical brilliance and quiet dominance to Vicente's paranoia, violence, and eventual collapse. If Amado was the Lord of the Skies, a man who bought time with surgical ambition, Vicente was the shadow of that greatness, unable to sustain the empire, relying on brutality instead of vision, and ultimately consumed by the very chaos he unleashed. The fall of El Viceroy was not just the fall of a man, but the death of a dynasty. The Carrillo Fuentes name, once synonymous with power, wealth, and influence, became just another cautionary tale in Mexico's bloody history of cartels. In the end, the empire that once ruled the skies was brought to its knees on the ground, undone by greed, violence, and a failure to adapt in a world where rivals thrived on chaos. The international manhunt for Mexico's most notorious drug lords, spanning decades, continents, and billions of dollars in resources, represents one of the most ambitious law enforcement campaigns in modern history. By the mid-1990s, the United States had already recognized that the trafficking networks feeding cocaine, heroin, and later methamphetamine into American cities were too vast to be tackled by Mexico alone. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, FBI, U.S. Marshals, and even the CIA became deeply entangled in operations designed to dismantle cartels like Juárez, Sinaloa, Gulf, and later Los Zetas. What began as border policing slowly evolved into an international chess match, where cartel bosses used bribery, violence, and technological sophistication to evade capture, while governments mobilized intelligence sharing, satellite surveillance, and joint strike forces to close in on them. The case of the Juárez cartel illustrates this global pursuit. After Amado Carrillo Fuentes' sudden death in 1997, U.S. agencies shifted their focus to his successors, especially Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, El Viceroy. But unlike his brother, who had kept a lower profile, Vicente's brutal methods drew enormous attention from the U.S. government. The DEA labeled him one of the world's most wanted men, placing multi-million-dollar bounties on his head. His associates were pursued not only in Mexico but across Latin America, Europe, and even Asia, where cartel-linked money laundering operations funneled billions through banks, casinos, and shell corporations. The DEA pioneered kingpin strategy, a method developed in Colombia during the takedown of Pablo Escobar, which focused on decapitating cartels by removing their leaders. Applied to Mexico, the strategy meant targeting the likes of El Viceroy, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, Ojael Cardenas of the Gulf Cartel, and Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales of Los Zetas. However, unlike Colombia, where Escobar's Medellín cartel collapsed relatively quickly after his death, Mexico's cartels proved more resilient. Each arrest or killing often splintered cartels into smaller, more violent factions, making them harder to track and more chaotic. International cooperation was not without friction. The DEA and U.S. authorities often distrusted their Mexican counterparts, who were deeply infiltrated by corruption. Cartel leaders paid fortunes to ensure leaks about operations, which allowed them to escape at the last minute. This problem was most famously highlighted by El Chapo Guzmán's legendary prison escapes, which embarrassed not only Mexico but also its U.S. allies. To counteract this, joint task forces were created, combining DEA intelligence with U.S. military surveillance and the Mexican Navy's elite special forces. These units became the backbone of high-profile captures in the 2010s. The extradition process became another battleground. For years, Mexican presidents resisted handing over top cartel figures to the U.S., citing sovereignty concerns. But the sheer level of cartel violence, coupled with repeated prison escapes, forced a policy shift. By the mid-2000s, extraditions increased dramatically, with dozens of top-level traffickers being flown to the U.S. to face trial. In American courts, they faced racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, and homicide charges that carried life sentences with no chance of parole. The most famous case was El Chapo's extradition in 2017, where he stood trial in Brooklyn under unprecedented security, eventually receiving a life sentence plus 30 years. His trial revealed the depth of corruption, the scale of cartel operations, and the role of International cooperation in bringing a mythic fugitive to justice. Financial warfare was just as critical as physical pursuit. Cartel empires thrived on their ability to launder billions of dollars through banks, businesses, and offshore accounts. In response, U.S. authorities, along with European and Asian allies, tightened financial oversight. Programs like the Kingpin Act allowed the U.S. Treasury Department to freeze assets linked to cartel leaders and their families. This financial chokehold aimed to cripple their ability to bribe officials, pay enforcers, or expand operations. Yet cartels proved adaptive, using cryptocurrencies, prepaid debit cards, and even Chinese money brokers to stay ahead of investigators. Meanwhile, the globalization of cartel networks meant the DEA and its partners had to expand their reach. Mexican cartels were no longer confined to trafficking across the U.S.-Mexico border. They began sending operatives into Central America, South America, Europe, West Africa, and East Asia. Cocaine routes shifted through Venezuela and West Africa, heroin markets grew in the U.S., and methamphetamine production expanded across continents. This forced agencies like Interpol, Europol, and law enforcement units in countries like Colombia, Spain, and China to coordinate more closely with the DEA. Major seizures in Spain, Belgium, and Italy often revealed Mexican fingerprints, showing how deeply embedded cartels had become in global trade. Cross-border operations also highlighted the role of technology. Satellites tracked clandestine airstrips in Mexico and Colombia, wiretaps intercepted encrypted communications, and undercover agents infiltrated money laundering schemes. One of the DEA's most effective tools became the controlled delivery method, allowing cartel shipments to be tracked across borders, exposing entire networks rather than just seizing drugs. These operations were often dangerous, as cartel leaders knew infiltration was their greatest threat, and they responded with extreme paranoia and violence against suspected informants. The international manhunts also exposed a profound paradox. While governments sought to bring down cartel leaders, the demand for drugs in the United States and Europe continued to grow, ensuring that new traffickers always emerged. This reality led critics to argue that the Kingpin strategy, while effective in securing dramatic arrests, did little to address the systemic drivers of the drug trade. Every time a figure like Vicente Carrillo Fuentes or El Chapo was captured, others stepped into the void. What international cooperation achieved, however, was the dismantling of the myth of invincibility. Cartel bosses could run, but they could not hide forever, not from satellites, not from joint task forces, and not from extradition courts. By the 2010s, the narrative had shifted. Where once cartel leaders like Pablo Escobar or Amado Carrillo Fuentes lived as larger-than-life legends, hunted but untouchable, the new reality was one of eventual capture. El Viceroy, El Chapo, Ojoel Cardenas, Trevino Morales, all fell. The message was clear: international pressure, relentless surveillance, and coordinated manhunts had made the world smaller for drug lords. Yet even as governments celebrated victories, the flow of narcotics continued, a reminder that the war was not against individuals but against an entire system of supply, demand, and corruption. The international manhunts for cartel leaders reshaped modern policing. They brought together military technology, financial intelligence, undercover operations, and diplomatic agreements in ways never seen before. But they also exposed the limitations of a war that arrests alone could not end. The captures of men like Vicente Carrillo Fuentes and El Chapo Guzman symbolized triumphs of justice, but they also raised haunting questions: how many more would rise to take their place, and how long could nations chase shadows across borders while the business of narcotics thrived in plain sight? The aftermath of international manhunts and kingpin takedowns left Mexico's underworld in a strange, chaotic state. For decades, cartels had been run like corporations, with centralized leadership, well-defined hierarchies, and vast networks of smugglers, financiers, and enforcers. When governments succeeded in capturing or killing bosses like Amado Carrillo Fuentes, Ojoel Cardenas Guillen, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the strategy appeared to deal decisive blows. But the unintended consequence was fragmentation. large cartels splintered into smaller, unpredictable mini-cartels. These groups lacked the discipline, stability, and long-term vision of their predecessors, but they compensated with brutality, territorial obsession, and innovation in the drug trade. This fragmentation reshaped Mexico's criminal landscape. Where once a handful of organizations, Juárez, Sinaloa, Gulf, and Tijuana, dominated, by the 2010s the country was dotted with dozens of competing factions. Groups such as Los Zetas, La Familia Michoacana, the Knights Templar, the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG, and countless local cells emerged from the fractures left behind. Each had its own methods, some were highly militarized, others deeply religious or cult-like, and still others purely transactional. Violence intensified as these groups fought over plazas, key smuggling routes and cities along the U.S.-Mexico border. The decline of centralized leadership also changed the character of cartel operations. Under bosses like Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the focus had been on maintaining business stability. Amado was infamous for preferring bribery over bloodshed. His fortune was secured by transporting massive loads of cocaine, not constant displays of terror. But when leadership splintered, younger, less experienced commanders relied on violence as their first tool of negotiation. Beheadings, mass executions, public displays of corpses, and grisly messages became common. These tactics weren't just about eliminating rivals, they were psychological warfare, designed to terrify entire communities and dissuade loyalty to competing groups. The rise of Los Zetas exemplifies this transformation. Originally formed by defectors from Mexico's elite special forces, the Zetas became the archetype of the violent mini-cartel. They expanded rapidly, not just in drug trafficking but also in extortion, kidnapping, oil theft, and human smuggling. Their model proved influential. Why rely solely on cocaine shipments when one could profit from every illegal business available? Other splinter groups followed suit, leading to diversification of cartel incomes. In many towns, cartels acted less like smugglers and more like occupying armies, taxing locals, infiltrating police forces, and using fear to control territory. Another consequence of fragmentation was the erosion of trust within cartel structures. In Amado's era, loyalty was paramount, betrayal of a boss was rare, and disloyalty could mean death. But with mini-cartels, shifting alliances became the norm. Leaders were frequently betrayed by lieutenants, splinter groups broke away after internal disputes, and the lines between allies and enemies blurred constantly. This instability made it harder for governments to track cartel dynamics, as yesterday's ally could be tomorrow's rival. It also made peace negotiations, such as those attempted in Colombia with guerrilla groups, nearly impossible, since Mexico's splintered factions lacked central command. The decentralization of cartel power also accelerated the use of advanced weaponry and tactics. Without a single boss to enforce restraint, smaller groups engaged in arms races. Heavy-caliber rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, armored vehicles, and even drones entered the battlefield. This militarization blurred the line between organized crime and insurgency. For many analysts, Mexico's drug war by the 2010s no longer resembled a fight against mafia-style organizations but rather a patchwork of insurgent armies, each controlling slices of territory. Financially, fragmentation made cartels harder to defeat. The mega-cartels of the past could be targeted through major seizures and financial crackdowns. But mini-cartels, operating in dozens of regions, were more resilient. They relied on smaller, diversified streams of income, making them difficult to cripple with one decisive strike. For example, while the DEA could track the billion-dollar cocaine shipments of Amado Carrillo, shutting down a local gang's extortion network proved far more challenging. This Hydra effect meant that every time a head was cut off, two more grew in its place. The fragmentation also reshaped cartel mythology. Figures like Amado or El Chapo lived as larger-than-life legends, their names whispered with a mix of fear and respect. But mini-cartel leaders often lacked the same charisma or longevity. Many were young, reckless, and short-lived, their reigns lasting only months before capture or death. This constant turnover created a more faceless violence. People feared the cartel as an abstract presence, not a singular figurehead. Communities caught in the crossfire mourned the loss of stability. Ironically, some even remembered the old bosses with a strange nostalgia, recalling that under Amado or El Chapo, violence was more controlled. Yet amidst the chaos, a new giant emerged from the rubble, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. Founded in the 2010s, CJNG learned from the failures of both centralized and fragmented groups. Led by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, CJNG combined the militarization of Los Zetas with the global ambition of Amado Carrillo. They built networks across 5 continents, invested heavily in methamphetamine and fentanyl production, and used social media for propaganda. Unlike smaller splinter groups, CJNG positioned itself as the next dominant power, challenging even Sinaloa for supremacy. This showed that while fragmentation weakened old cartels, it also created the conditions for new, even more dangerous powers to rise. For ordinary Mexicans, the fragmentation of cartels translated into prolonged suffering. Entire towns became battlegrounds. Businesses closed, schools emptied, and thousands fled northward as refugees. Mass graves were uncovered regularly, a grim testament to the scale of violence. Families lived with uncertainty, unsure whether to pay extortion fees, flee, or risk defiance. The government, stretched thin, could not provide consistent protection. The dream that taking down kingpins would bring peace had dissolved. Instead, each victory seemed to unleash a new wave of violence. Internationally, the rise of mini-cartels complicated cooperation. While the DEA could coordinate with Mexico to capture a major boss, dismantling dozens of smaller cells proved almost impossible. Europe and Asia reported increased encounters with Mexican traffickers who no longer worked under one cartel banner but acted independently or in small syndicates. The drug trade became more diffuse, more decentralized, and thus harder to disrupt. In hindsight, the fragmentation of cartels serves as one of the most important lessons of the drug war. The removal of powerful figures like Amado Carrillo Fuentes or El Chapo did not end the narcotics trade, it simply shifted its structure. Instead of a few major empires, the landscape fractured into many smaller kingdoms, each more volatile, each less predictable. The myth of the singular, drug lord ruling with iron control gave way to the reality of a decentralized, hydra-headed beast. And yet, for all its chaos, fragmentation also exposed the vulnerability of cartels. No group was invincible, no leader untouchable. The constant splintering revealed the instability at the heart of organized crime, a reminder that power built on fear and bloodshed could never truly last. The weight of Mexico's cartel wars has been carried most heavily not by the traffickers themselves, nor even by the governments that pursue them, but by ordinary citizens, families, workers, and entire communities. Caught between the ambitions of drug lords and the strategies of the state. If one listens closely to the story of Mexico's drug conflict, beneath the roar of gunfire and the headlines of kingpin captures lies a quieter, more devastating truth. The daily lives of millions have been reshaped by decades of violence, corruption, and fear. By the late 1990s, after Amado Carrillo Fuentes' sudden death, Mexico was already deeply entrenched in a violent underworld. But it was the 2000s and 2010s, particularly after President Felipe Calderón launched his militarized campaign against cartels in 2006, that the social fabric began to tear at alarming speed. Streets once filled with laughter became silent at night, businesses shuttered, and whole towns became ghostly shadows of what they once were. The cartel wars touched every corner of Mexican life, politics, culture, economy, and even the way people dreamed of their futures. Politically, the drug war corroded trust in institutions. Local mayors, governors, police chiefs, and even members of the federal government were frequently found complicit with cartels. Communities never knew whether the uniformed officers patrolling their neighborhoods were protectors or predators. In cities like Ciudad Juárez, once a thriving border hub, residents began to view law enforcement with suspicion equal to that reserved for traffickers. Democracy itself came under siege, as cartels financed political campaigns to ensure candidates who would protect their interests. For ordinary citizens, the ballot box lost meaning when they suspected the results were written in blood money. The economy, too, bore the marks of conflict. Extortion became as profitable as drug trafficking for many splinter groups. Small businesses, from corner shops to large factories, were forced to pay protection fees just to operate. Those who refused faced arson, kidnapping, or execution. Farmers found themselves coerced into growing opium poppies or marijuana instead of traditional crops, caught between cartel threats and the army's eradication campaigns. Migrant workers heading northward became targets for kidnapping and ransom, their vulnerability exploited as yet another income stream. The cumulative effect was devastating: economic stagnation in cartel-controlled areas, mass displacement, and a steady erosion of opportunity. Culturally, the cartel wars left an indelible mark on Mexican identity. Corridos, traditional folk ballads, evolved into narco corridos, songs that glorified traffickers, recounting their exploits with both admiration and fear. For some, these songs were cultural expression; for others, they were troubling symbols of how violence had seeped into the national psyche. Young people in poor neighborhoods, seduced by tales of fast cars, luxurious mansions, and easy money, began to idolize cartel leaders. Figures like Amado Carrillo Fuentes or El Chapo Guzman became anti-heroes, their lives mythologized in the same way American culture mythologized outlaws of the Wild West. Yet behind these myths lay despair, for many youths saw cartel life as the only escape from poverty. The human toll of the conflict cannot be overstated. Since the escalation of the war in 2006, hundreds of thousands have been killed, and tens of thousands more have disappeared. Families live with the agony of uncertainty, never knowing if missing relatives are alive or buried in mass graves that continue to be uncovered. Entire generations of children have grown up in the shadow of cartel violence, their lullabies replaced by the sound of gunfire, their playgrounds patrolled by armed men. For many, trauma became an inheritance, passed silently from parents to children. Religious and community institutions attempted to fill the void where the state failed. Churches became sanctuaries for the grieving, while grassroots organizations emerged to search for the disappeared, often at great personal risk. Mothers' collectives, armed with shovels and determination, dug into the earth themselves, hoping to recover the remains of loved ones the authorities had given up on. These acts of courage reflected the resilience of ordinary Mexicans, who, despite unimaginable suffering, refused to surrender entirely to despair. The impact of cartel violence also spilled across borders. As communities fled violence, waves of migrants crossed into the United States, not only seeking economic opportunity but also safety. Some brought with them stories of brutality that reshaped international perceptions of Mexico. Tourism, once a proud economic pillar, suffered in regions plagued by violence, as international visitors feared becoming collateral damage in cartel wars. Mexico's global image became entwined with images of burning vehicles, masked gunmen, and heavily armed soldiers patrolling city streets. Yet even in the midst of tragedy, art and literature emerged as tools of resistance. Mexican filmmakers, novelists, and journalists sought to document the human cost of the conflict, giving voice to those silenced by fear. Writers chronicled the despair of Juárez, photographers captured the resilience of grieving families, and musicians used their platforms to denounce corruption. This cultural output ensured that the suffering of ordinary citizens was neither invisible nor forgotten, even as politicians and traffickers treated lives as expendable. Corruption, however, remained the most insidious wound. With billions of dollars in drug profits flowing through the system, cartels bought loyalty at every level, from rural police officers to federal officials. For ordinary citizens, this meant living in a twilight zone where the line between state and cartel was blurred. Reporting crimes often felt useless, as the same police who took statements might also deliver information to criminal bosses. This erosion of trust left many communities isolated, forced to rely on themselves rather than the government. And yet, despite all of this, Mexico endured. The resilience of its people shone through the cracks of violence. Families continued to celebrate traditional festivals, preserving cultural rituals as acts of defiance. Students continued to pursue education, even in towns racked by conflict, dreaming of futures beyond cartel influence. Journalists, at great personal risk, continued to investigate and tell the truth, ensuring the world would not forget the names of the dead. The societal impact of cartel wars ultimately revealed two Mexicos, one governed by fear and violence, the other sustained by resilience and hope. For every story of tragedy, there was one of endurance, for every act of brutality, one of quiet defiance. Ordinary citizens bore the brunt of a war they did not start, yet they also became the keepers of its memory and the guardians of its lessons. The legacy of this suffering is complex. While governments tally arrests and seizures, and cartels count profits and losses, ordinary Mexicans measure the cost in funerals, empty chairs at family tables, and the silence of missing voices. Their resilience is both a tragedy and a testament, proof that even amidst relentless darkness, the spirit of a people can endure, though not without scars that will last for generations. As the story of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the fabled Señor de los Cielos, comes to its final chapter, we are left with more than just the tale of a man who rose from obscurity to command one of the most powerful criminal empires in modern history. His life, and his death, encapsulate the paradox of the drug war itself, a world where immense wealth, fleeting power, and mythic reputation are purchased at the cost of constant paranoia, staggering violence, and ultimate fragility. To understand Amado's legacy is to reflect not only on the man himself but also on the larger forces that shaped Mexico, the United States, and the shadowy crossroads where both nations' destinies converged. Amado's empire was built on ingenuity. He did not rely solely on the brutality that defined other drug lords, instead, he innovated. His fleet of aircraft transformed the logistics of the cocaine trade, earning him the nickname that would outlive him, the Lord of the Skies. In doing so, he symbolized the globalization of narcotics, where once smuggling was a local affair conducted in secrecy along borders, Amado elevated it into an international operation. He proved that cartels could operate as multinational corporations, moving product across continents with precision. Yet, for all his sophistication, Amado remained a prisoner of the same vulnerabilities that had doomed men before him. His empire, vast though it was, could not protect him from the ticking clock of fear and the weight of enemies closing in. His death in 1997, on an operating table as surgeons attempted to alter his appearance through plastic surgery, became as infamous as his life. That a man so powerful, who once commanded fleets and armies of men, should perish in such a vulnerable, human moment is a reminder of the futility of invincibility. Even legends bleed. Even legends, in their final hours, are reduced to the same mortality as the rest of us. The whispers that followed, rumors that he faked his death, that he escaped to another life, that the man buried was not truly him, only deepened his myth. In a way, those rumors ensured Amado would live on, not only in fact but in folklore. His story mirrors that of Mexico itself during this era, a nation grappling with corruption, staggering inequality, and the weight of external pressures. Amado's rise was made possible by institutions weakened by bribery, by a political class willing to turn a blind eye in exchange for favors, and by the insatiable demand for drugs north of the border. His fall reflected the inevitability of violence in a world where loyalty was fragile, and where governments, spurred by international pressure, could no longer afford to ignore cartel power. But his legacy extends far beyond his personal empire. The Juárez Cartel he left behind did not collapse overnight. Instead, it fragmented, fought, and adapted, contributing to the waves of violence that defined the 2000s and 2010s. His successors attempted to live up to his reputation, but none possessed his blend of vision and restraint. As Mexico plunged into cycles of bloodshed between warring cartels, many looked back to Amado's reign as a paradoxical, golden age, an era where, despite corruption and crime, the violence was seen as more contained, more businesslike, compared to the chaos that followed. Amado Carrillo Fuentes thus occupies a strange space in history. To law enforcement, he was a kingpin, a symbol of the global narcotics trade. To rivals, he was both a target and a standard against which others measured themselves. To the people of Mexico, he was a contradiction, feared for his power, respected for his cunning, and mythologized as a figure who somehow seemed larger than life, even in death. In folklore, he became something akin to a Robin Hood figure in certain regions, with stories of generosity and protection, though these tales often glossed over the darker truths of his empire. When reflecting on Amado's legacy, one cannot ignore the broader lesson, that the drug war is less about individuals than it is about systems. Amado's removal from the chessboard did not end the game, it simply reshuffled the pieces. Others rose, others fell, and the narcotics continued to flow. The demand never ceased, and where there is demand, there will always be supply. Amado was a chapter, not the book itself. And yet, that chapter continues to haunt. His story embodies the duality of myth and reality. In myth, he is eternal, the Lord of the skies, untouchable, perhaps even still alive somewhere, watching from the shadows. In reality, he was a man undone by the same greed, fear, and mortality that haunt all who enter the world of organized crime. That duality is what keeps his memory alive. It is why his name still surfaces in conversations about the great drug lords of history, alongside Pablo Escobar and Joaquin Guzman. For those listening now, perhaps drifting into sleep with this story echoing in their minds, the tale of Amado Carrillo Fuentes serves as both cautionary tale and eerie bedtime legend. It reminds us that power achieved through blood and deception is fleeting. That empires built in the shadows may rise high but cast long, dark shadows over generations. And that every man, no matter how wealthy or feared, must eventually face the inescapable truth of mortality. As the night deepens and the final words of this story linger, imagine the silhouette of an airplane cutting across the darkened Mexican sky. Below, cities hum with quiet fear, above, the stars burn indifferent to the struggles of men. Somewhere in that vastness lies the memory of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, who flew higher than most but could not outrun the weight of time. His story has ended, but its echoes remain, shaping the world he left behind, an eternal reminder that legends are never simple, and that shadows often outlast the men who cast them.